video we're going to start talking about the novel Life of Pi, and we're going to focus on part 1. So we're going to focus on 4 particular aspects of part 1 which are important to know in terms of the context of part 2 and the novel in general. And you definitely can be asked contextual questions on part 1, even though the main action does happen in part 2. Part 1 is integral to understanding part 2. These are also really important points that you can include in a literary essay if you select to do the essay based on Life of Pi. So over here, as you can see, we're going to discuss some key characters, and this little quote of "it is true that those we meet can change us, sometimes so profoundly that we are not the same afterwards," is very, very much true of the characters we're going to discuss, because these characters that are present in part 1 really influence Pi and help him on his journey through the Pacific, and also in his life after the being at sea debacle. Then we also are going to talk about religion, and particularly Pi's perspective of religion, which is a very unique perspective of religion. So we're going to unpack his whole journey towards having 3 religions and what his ultimate idea of religion is, and that's really important for part 2. When we discuss part 2, you'll see how that religion plays an important role. We're also going to discuss what the zoo means to Pi and how it's important. And then lastly, but very importantly, we're going to talk about animal related skills and lessons, because part 1 is about Pi's life in India, and that life that he has as the zookeeper's son is very important because he learns a lot of lessons which help him survive at sea. So understanding these lessons is important. So the way that I've done this is through using quotes. The reason why I think quotes are such a nice way to analyze a piece of literature is obviously because it's directly from the text. So I've compiled the notes that reference these different characters and themes. And also what's really nice is I hope that you can take note of some of the important quotes, because if you do choose to write the literature essay on Life of Pi, it is always really appreciated and really it elevates your answer if you include 1 or 2 quotes in each body paragraph. I would definitely advise that you watch my video on how to integrate quotes if you're planning on using quotes. I would definitely advise that you do. So as we go through this, definitely take note of some of the important quotes and make some notes as well, because Life of Pi is a really dense book. There's a lot going on, there's a lot of themes, there's a lot of things to think about, and it's not easy concepts. They're really philosophical. So definitely take some notes as you go through, because as I say, this is just part 1. Alright, so we'll start with Pi himself, and obviously we're just talking about Pi in terms of Pi in part 1 and how he grows up. So he was named after a famous swimming pool. He's a keen swimmer. He was bullied at school, especially due to his name. He is a vegetarian. He's very religious. He's definitely a thinker. He is eager to explore different ideas and go beyond others' definitions of normal. He seems more mature in some of his thoughts and actions than a typical teenager. So that's just some analysis, and now we can get into some quotes that really prove this. "The sound would disappear, but the hurt would linger, but I always heard the slur. I would suffer from following in the footsteps of a popular older sibling." So this talks about his struggles at school and how he's bullied and how he doesn't really fit in and find his place. But through his nickname, in that elusive irrational number with which scientists try to understand the universe, I found refuge. So through the number Pi, or the word that we use to describe this number, he finds refuge. He finds sort of a new identity, a way to allow himself to be okay in this environment, which he doesn't really enjoy. I didn't know much about politics. That is important because the reason why they decide to immigrate, or why Pi's father decides to immigrate, is because of politics. And his whole family, actually, him, his mother, and his brother, are all pretty averse to immigrating. They don't understand why, or they don't want to. And he admits, I don't know much about politics. I don't understand why we have to leave. He feels like he has a really good life at the Pondicherry Zoo. "Religion will save us. I was more afraid than in a few words thrown out, he might destroy something that I loved." So this is when he's talking to Mr. Kumar, his biology teacher, and Mr. Kumar is an atheist, he is a communist, and so he doesn't believe in religion. And Pi is very adamant that religion will save us, and he gets very, very concerned by the idea that if Mr. Kumar says that he doesn't believe in religion, that it's gonna like destroy it for him, and he can't bear that. So he really has this strong connection to religion and faith. And he says, what a terrible disease that must be if it could kill God in a man. So he really doesn't understand how you can live your life without any sort of God, without any sort of faith. Like me, they go as far as the legs of reason will carry them, and then they leap. And I love this quote. I think it's so interesting because here we're introduced to what Pi perceives of religion. While many people see religion as, different demarcations between people and different distinctions, the way that Pi sees it is he sees it as this unifying force, that we all believe in something. And he even goes as far in this quote to say that atheists, we're all on the same sort of level, and that those who are religious and those who are atheists, they actually are more similar than they think. Because he says, as a religious person like me, they, talking about atheists, people who don't believe in God, go as far as the legs of reason will carry them, and then they leap. So they go as far as they can, understand the world in a reasonable, rational headspace, and then they take the leap, and they have to actually have some sort of faith or some sort of, you can't go reason up to a certain, you go with a reasonable sort of headspace up to a certain point, and then you have to actually have faith. And that's really important for what we're going to discuss in part 2. So definitely keep that quote in mind. To choose doubt as a philosophy of life is akin to choosing immobility as a means of transportation. This novel is so dense with some really hectic quotes that really make you think about life. And here Pi says that, and this shows us that he is really wise beyond his years. He says to choose doubt in life, to doubt things, is almost like choosing immobility, which means like not moving as a mode of transport, meaning it's no way to live. You can't possibly achieve anything if you're going to doubt something. The monkeys never asked for the news from Delhi, so this shows he finds comfort in being with the animals. He doesn't have to talk about the real world or what's happening. And as he says, there was no emergency in my world. He doesn't understand, and he doesn't want to understand the political context in which he's living, and all the pressures that are going to lead his father to decide to move the family to Canada. Next we have his father, Pi's father, Mr. Patel. He runs the Pondicherry Zoo. He used to run a hotel in Madras, and there's a nice little paragraph where Pi talks about or narrates how it's very similar running a hotel to running a zoo, which I think is quite humorous because we wouldn't necessarily think these are two similar things. He prides himself on being a secular man, and so this is very interesting because both Pi's father and mother are not religious, and Pi's adoption of religion really confuses him because he prides himself on being secular, on being modern and contemporary. Decides to move the family to Canada as India's political situation worsens. He teaches Pi and Ravi is Pi's brother, important lessons about the true nature of animals, and he cares about and for the animals. So let's have a look at some quotes that back up these statements. The disciplining of children, like the tending to animals, was generally left to father. So this speaks about that sort of distinguishing of the different roles of his parents. So father cares for the animals, he works, and he also disciplines the children. Father saw himself as a part of the new India, rich, modern, and as secular as ice cream. So to him, religion is sort of seen as a regression. He's never been religious, and he doesn't understand Pi's fascination with religion. Spiritual worry was alien to him. He's never experienced spiritual worry or sort of concern in faith. It was financial worry that rocked his being. So as the provider for the family, he is worrying about finances, not necessarily about spirituality. There are separate religions. They have nothing in common. So that's what he thinks about religion. He doesn't understand why Pi wants how he can have all these different religions, because in his mind they're separate. They don't have anything in common. India is on the cusp of becoming a truly modern and advanced nation. If you don't let technology help you, if you resist good ideas, you condemn yourself to dinosaurhood. So we can see that father is definitely someone who values progress and, modernity. The answer is the same the world over. People move in the hope of a better life. That's basically why anyone would immigrate, in the hope of a better life. A zoo is a cultural institution. So this comes in when Pi talks about moving a zoo and how it's incredibly difficult. And he also talks about running a zoo being difficult because it's not like a business. It's a cultural institution. You're not going to make a ton of money from a zoo, but it's an important thing to have in a society. It provides happiness, provides joy. The greater good and the greater profit are not compatible aims. So he talks about how the greater good, and he sees the zoo as a greater good. It's not compatible, it's not aligned with greater profit. Like, you're not going to make a lot of money from running a zoo. Long term, bad politics is bad for business. Another reason why you would be inclined to immigrate. People move because of the wear and tear of anxiety, because of the gnawing feeling that no matter how hard they work, their efforts will yield nothing, that what they build in 1 year will be torn down in 1 day by others. So that's important because that's another reason why you'd immigrate, is the fear of what you've been building your entire life could be destroyed. And during this time, India was at a time of crisis and there was a lot of disorder, and so there was that definite danger or threat of everything that fathers work towards declining, and that's why he decides to move the family. This next quote actually comes from part 2, but I've included it here because part 2 we're not really going to be talking about father too much, but father regularly sedated a number of the animals to lessen their stress, and this proves really important. This is on the cargo ship. Father sedates the animals to ensure that they are, not so stressed. This shows us about father that he is incredibly caring, but also it's going to be really important for the storyline because it's one of the reasons why Richard Parker doesn't attack Pi the minute they sort of see each other, because the sedation is still wearing off. Then we have mother, Mrs. Patel. She received a Baptist education and she loves to read. I really love this description over here, these two descriptions about mothers. Pi's mother's perspective on religion. Father sees it as completely crazy in terms of Pi adopting all these religions. He sees them as different things. He thinks of himself as progressive and secular, and his mother is equally as sort of astonished, but she's more bored and neutral on the subject of religion. The Hindu upbringing and the Baptist education had precisely cancelled each other out as far as religion was concerned and had left her serenely impious. And that quote, "We owe them good schools." This is sort of significant in terms of the context. So remember that Pi is sort of Hindu by birth. His parents are not religious, but he is sort of by default Hindu. And here his mother talks about having a Baptist education, and so and the fact that we owe them good schools. So here she's talking about Christianity. So she was a Hindu, or she is a Hindu, and then she goes to school and she receives a Christian education, and Pi remarks how they sort of cancelled each other out to make her serenely impious, that she's not religious in any sense. And we owe them good schools as a result of the missionaries that came to India and built these schools where a lot of students were then educated. She also agrees with father. She says, "These are terribly old-fashioned things you've taken to." She doesn't understand why Pi would be going sort of backward, in her opinion, into taking on religion. She even says perhaps Pi is marching to a different drumbeat of progress. She doesn't understand what drumbeat, but she says maybe his version of progress is different. And then the last quote, this is before they get on the ship to leave for Canada. The questions that swirled in mother's mind as she contemplated buying cigarettes, and Pi relates how his mother was like, should we buy cigarettes, even though she's never smoked in her life. It's just that sort of fear and anxiety of moving to a new place, and how she was just wanting to buy cigarettes. She doesn't know what's going to happen. I think you can put it in your head as this is happening, I think in like the 1940s, if I'm not mistaken. So you think of today, when you go to a new country, there's still a sense of like nerves, right? But we have the chance to Google it and research it before we actually go. In this case, in the story, they don't have that ability, and they're going to Canada forever. It's a long place, it's a very far away place. They don't know what to expect, and so the show is sort of mother's anxiety. Okay, Pi's brother, Ravi. He's a star cricketer and popular kid at school, and he mocks Pi for his religious beliefs. So they have a very different experience of school. Pi is bullied, he doesn't really fit in, whereas Ravi is like, the star kid. A fearsome bowler and a powerful batter, the captain of the town's best cricket team. You only need to convert to 3 more religions to be on holiday for the rest of your life. I really love that quote. I thought it was quite funny. But the first one shows that he is this star cricketer, different to Pi, definitely. And the next one shows how he mocks Pi, and he's like, oh, you know, you just got to take on some more religions and you're going to be on holiday for the whole week, or for the rest of your life. I think what's important to note about Ravi is that Pi, they don't really get along, but they're still brothers, and Pi is definitely going to be really upset when Ravi dies. And so just that sort of family connection, that even though this family doesn't seem to maybe understand every aspect of each other, they're still family, and the loss of his parents and his brother really takes a toll on Pi, as you would expect. Alright, then we have Mamaji, who is very important to the story. He's the family friend who teaches Pi to swim, but he's also the one who tells the author of Pi's story, who we refer to just as the author in the book. And he says the way he prefaces the story is it's one that which will make you believe in God. And he tells him this years later in a coffee shop in Pondicherry, and that prompts the author to actually go and visit Pi in Canada and interview him and write this book. He's a very active man. Mamaji swam 30 lengths every morning, and the fact that he teaches Pi to swim is also significant because he survives the shipwreck, which none of his family does because, well, there's a couple of reasons why, but one of the things that sets him apart from his family is he knows how to swim. Alright, and then we have our 3 characters who influence Pi in terms of religion. So let's actually start with the Hindu Pandit. This is Pi's Hindu spiritual leader. We don't have a name for him, but we can understand that he's sort of known Pi for, like, you know, since he was young, because by default Pi is Hindu based on his birth and his upbringing. Then we have Father Martin, who teaches Pi about Christianity. And then we have Satish Kumar, who, there's 2 Satish Kumars. This is the baker, who is the Muslim man, and he inspires Pi's interest in Islam. He's a key influencer in Pi's decision to study religion at the University of Toronto years later. So he says here in this quote, Mr. and Mr. Kumar led me to study zoology and religious studies at the University of Toronto, talking about the 2 different Mr. Kumars, this one obviously referring to religious studies. And he marveled at everything. When Mr. Kumar comes to visit the zoo, Pi shows him around really proudly. He's like, you know, you don't have to pay. And he shows him around. And it's really important because both of the Mr. Kumars are at the zoo at the same time, and we can compare and contrast how they view the animals and how they think of it. And so we see here Mr. Kumar, he marveled at everything, sort of God's creation. He sees everything and he's like, wow, this is impressive. And obviously we also have all 3 of these men who meet Pi and his parents that one day, where his parents are alerted to the fact that Pi is currently practicing 3 different religions. Then we have the other Satish Kumar, who is Pi's biology teacher. He is a communist, he's an atheist who holds scientific beliefs, and he inspires Pi to study zoology years later after the shipwreck when he's studying in Canada. He was a regular visitor who read the labels and descriptive notices in their entirety and approved of every animal he saw. Each to him was a triumph of logic and mechanics, and nature as a whole was an exceptionally fine illustration of science. So here we can see the contrast in terms of how the other Mr. Kumar looks at these animals. So the Muslim Mr. Kumar, he looks at them, wow, this is God's creation. Whereas the communist Mr. Kumar, he goes and he looks at all the descriptions and he's like, wow, you know, all this science, all these things that have been created. He wants to know all the knowledge and he wants to see sort of how they work in a sort of logical manner. When Mr. Kumar visited the zoo, it was to take the pulse of the universe, and his stethoscopic mind always confirmed to him that everything was in order, that everything was order. He left the zoo feeling scientifically refreshed. So to him, the zoo confirms his beliefs about the world. One might say it's my temple. So obviously, if you're a communist and atheist, you're not religious, but he's saying one might say it's my temple. This is the place where he reconnects with his version of the universe and what he believes. If we had politicians like these goats and rhinos, we'd have fewer problems in our country. And so this talks about his belief in communism, because communism believes in the sense of sort of equality or working for the common good. And so what he sees in the animals is a work towards the common good, as opposed to the politicians within the political situation in India of the time, where, you know, it's not necessarily looking like they're functioning for the common good. There are no grounds for going beyond a scientific explanation of reality, and no sound reason for believing anything but our sense of experience. A clear intellect, close attention to detail, and a little scientific knowledge will expose religion as superstitious bosh. God does not exist. So this is his perspective of the world, and he says that you shouldn't be seeing life as anything as what it is. You should use your own experience to justify sort of scientific claims. So you can't just believe in something that someone else has told you, like for instance God. You must rather see the world for yourself and make conclusions based on that. And this is important because as much as Pi is religious, he really respects Mr. Kumar, and he does take on board a lot of what he says, and you'll see that in part 2 as well. He definitely employs reason, and that's one of the key reasons for his survival, is that he combines his sense of religion but also with the sense of reason. Some people say God died during the partition in 1947, so here reference the political situation why he doesn't believe in God. It wasn't God who saved me, it was medicine. So here is someone who believes in reason, in rationality and science over religion. As he says, reason is my prophet and it tells me as a watch stops, so we die. So that's his perspective of life. You live your life, you die. Unlike, religion, where it's almost like there's an afterlife and there's all other things going on. Mr. Kumar led me to study zoology and religious studies at the University of Toronto, as we mentioned earlier, and then he does remark on one of the animals that he sees. It's the Rolls Royce of equids, and I just thought that was such an interesting line because it's such an oxymoron, because a Rolls Royce is, the fanciest car you can get, and equids means equality, and this just shows us how he believes that equality is like the most important thing, that really communist sort of headspace of working together for the greater good, and we can see that in that line, the Rolls Royce of equids. Alright, so moving on to religion. So we're going to start with Hinduism. We're going to go in the order of these religions that Pi adopts. So this is the religion Pi was born into, although his parents don't practice it. It shows Pi an important perspective regarding his suffering, which allows him to reframe his suffering as a castaway. So this is a really important religious aspect that he practices when he is in the Pacific, when he is on the lifeboat or the raft. It allows him to put his suffering into perspective. It's sort of a really key thing to allow him to keep going. So remember this for part 2. I became loyal to these sense impressions even before I knew what they meant or what they were for. It is my heart that commands me so. I feel at home in a Hindu temple. I'm aware of presence, not personal the way we usually feel presence, but something larger. Truly, I am in a sacred cosmic womb, a place where everything is born, and it is my sweet luck to behold its living core. But religion is more than rite and ritual. There is what the rite and ritual stand for. The universe makes sense to me through Hindu eyes. That's a really nice, short, easy quote to include. It encompasses that key theme of how he feels at home in Hinduism, how he understands the world through Hindu eyes. The liberation accounts of each of us is credited and debited depending on our actions. I've been a Hindu all my life, with this notion that mind I see my place in the universe. She sees in Krishna's mouth the whole complete, entire, timeless universe. So in this way, he really connects with this Hindu idea of how the universe is perceived, and this allows him to, he really has a connection with it while he's even in India and when he's growing up, but especially in part 2 when he's a castaway in the Pacific, he is able to understand the universe and put his suffering in perspective through his relationship to his Hindu beliefs. We then have Christianity. This is the second religion Pi acquires. The missionaries have been in India for a long time. Initially, Pi struggles to connect with such a human figure of God. He sees Jesus as too human of a God, when he tries to compare it to sort of Hinduism's version of God. He's like, this is too much of a human. How can I praise this human? But what we're going to see about Pi through these quotes is that he has his adoption of all these religions is not sort of purposeful in the sense that he goes into a church and he tries to adopt a religion, but it's all based on his intuition and this connection that he feels, and it's very authentic. in that regard. And so Christianity, he initially doesn't understand it, but then he feels this connection to it, and instead of resisting that connection, he leans into that connection and sees what Christianity can teach him about the world and how it can help him and how he can improve that connection with it. I knew very little about the religion. It had the reputation for a few gods and great violence. I was filled with a sense of peace. What peculiar psychology. It's a god on too human a scale. I couldn't get him out of my head. Christianity is a religion in a rush. And so here we see all his differing thoughts as he adopts Christianity. He initially doesn't know much about it. He then, when he's has the experience in a church, he actually feels this connection. He feels a sense of peace, and so he really leans into it, trying to understand what the religion's about. And he says, I couldn't get him out of my head, meaning he couldn't get, the Christian's version of God out of his head. I do like this quote. I thought it was quite an interesting remark, that Christianity is a religion in a rush, meaning that everything seems to happen really quickly. If you think of like the days of creation from the Bible, it happens in a rush. It happens within a week. And thirdly, we have Islam, the third religion Pi acquires. His link to the religion is very closely regarded to his relationship with the baker, Mr. Kumar. Pi's mother in particular struggles to understand Pi's adoption of this particular religion, and you can think about Pi's upbringing and his context to understand that deeper. Quick, necessary, physical, muttered, striking. It is a beautiful religion of brotherhood and devotion. It felt good to bring my forehead to the ground. Immediately it felt like a deep religious contact. I describe Mr. Kumar's place as a hovel, yet no mosque, church, or temple ever felt so sacred to me. I sometimes came out of that bakery feeling heavy with glory. I would climb onto my bicycle and pedal that glory through the air. I knelt a mortal, I rose an immortal. The presence of God is the finest of rewards. I prayed outside because I liked it. I faced Mecca with the help of a line I scratched into the pale yellow ground and carefully kept it up. So here we can see Islam is definitely a major religion, a religion that has a major effect on Pi, and particularly notice the emphasis on prayer. I mean, obviously Islam does focus a lot on prayer, and especially Pi's acquisition of it, and this is going to be quite important in terms of Pi's routine when he's on the Pacific, because his praying routine is important. It sort of keeps his mind and keeps his sanity and his routine going, which is really important for his mental capacity at sea. And so lastly, I wanted to just chat about Pi's version or perspective of religions, because obviously it's quite different to understand the religions in isolation, because we have to understand the religions in conjunction with one another to understand Pi's headspace. So to him, religion is interconnected, provides him with peace, stability, and meaning. It shows Pi's desire to continue learning and his unique ability to see the world through a different lens. He experiences an innate connection to each religion. Hindus, in their capacity for love, are indeed hairless Christians, just as Muslims in the way they see God in everything are bearded Hindus, and Christians in their devotion to God are hat-wearing Muslims. So here we can see that he really believes, he's not like his parents who believe that each of these religions is distinct and there's nothing in common. To him, they all have something unique, very much in common. To offer thanks to Lord Krishna for having put Jesus of Nazareth, whose humanity I found so compelling, in my way. So this is just a really sort of interesting statement, which you don't hear often, because Pi's perspective on religion, his adoption of all these religions, is definitely unique. So he basically thanks Lord Krishna for alerting him to Jesus and for showing him the pathway of Christianity. So he thanks his Hindu God for showing him the Christian God. I can well imagine an atheist's last words. Alas, a sense of community. So that's sort of referencing the sense of how he doesn't understand particularly how atheists could be, because to him they have no faith, they have no hope, and he doesn't understand how you could live your life without religion, in the sense that how can you live your life without faith or hope. Alas, the sense of community that are common with faith brings to a people spell trouble for me. So this talks about how, despite the fact that he is very much involved in all these religions and he attends prayer services and things like that, there is a distinctive separation, especially after everyone finds out he's been practicing all three religions. He can't really converse with his community. He doesn't have that community aspect to his religion, because people don't understand how he can be dedicated to three different religions. They didn't know that I was practicing Hindu, Christian, and Muslim. I was a practicing Hindu, Christian, and Muslim. Teenagers always hide a few things from their parents, isn't that so? So I thought that was an interesting quote, because obviously what teenagers are typically hiding from their parents is not necessarily that they're practicing 3 religions. We were to meet not just one wise man, but all 3. So this is when his parents do find out about the fact that he's been practicing 3 religions, where they meet all 3 wise men one day. So there's like a twist of fate. Babu Gandhi said, all religions are true. I just want to love God. To me, religion is about our dignity, not our depravity. I want to be baptized and I would like a prayer rug. So these 3 quotes just show us how dedicated he is to religion, how he truly, this is very like sort of innocent connection to religion, how he just really believes that all religions are true and that he just wants to love God in every capacity that he can. And that, that second last quote I think is really, a unique perspective, that religion is about dignity and not depravity. Well, maybe not unique perspective, but definitely something to think about, that to him it represents sort of our humanness instead of what we lack, which I think sometimes we can see, different religions maybe bring out more depravity than dignity within us. So just something to think about. I would like to be baptized and like a prayer rug. This shows us how he's dedicated to all 3 religions that he registers his interest towards. He is dedicated to all 3. Okay, the planetary zoo, just a nice short slide. Now it is so small it fits in my head. It was paradise on earth. I explore it now, and the only place left for it, my memory. Moving a zoo is like moving a city. Just a couple of things to say about the planetary zoo. So this talks about, it was paradise on earth. Pi really found a sense of peace within the planetary zoo. He really loved it. It's one of his key childhood memories. Also, it speaks to the theme of memory and how, Pi loses a lot in this novel. And the planetary zoo is one of those things that he lost. But he says, it's so small it fits in his head now. And previously he sort of makes this comment about how it was when he was a child. It was so massive. When you're a child and you imagine a place, it's like, or when you go through life, everything seems so big. I'm sure you've experienced that. And then when you go back to that place, maybe as an adult, it seems a lot smaller, and you're like, is this how I remember it? And to him now, it's like a really sad realization that it's so small for him now, it just fits in his head. He's the only person in his life who sort of remembers it, and he can only explore it in his mind. The loss of the zoo, even though the loss of the zoo happens, before the shipwreck, it's incredibly not hurtful, but it definitely makes an impact on Pi. He found a home, he found a lot of passion within the planetary zoo. And also the last one, moving a zoo is like moving a city. Just, remember the preparations for immigrating took about a year, because moving a zoo is a really, really hefty feat. Okay, and lastly, so these are the lessons that he learns about animals and the skills that he masters, which are going to be incredibly helpful for him on his journey with Richard Parker. So some of the key things that he learns is that animals might actually prefer zoos to the wild, and he talks about misinformation about zoos. Animals are dangerous and not to be anthropomorphized. You should not treat animals as humans because they are dangerous. You don't even think of them as animals. How to tame or train an animal to an extent, or get control of an animal. It's really important to remember that he does learn these skills, but he never actually has to apply them before he's on the raft. And he's not he's a teenager. He's not some person who is well versed in survival skills or an expert by any means. But these few things that he knows about animals help him control Richard Parker to some extent. The similarities and differences between animals and humans. Always expect the unexpected with regard to animals and to life. And Pi uses the metaphor of animals to explain how we should always expect the unexpected. And respecting animals, finally. So let's have a look at some quotes. Animals in the wild lead lives of compulsion and necessity within an unforgiving social hierarchy, an environment where the supply of food is low and where territory must be constantly defended and parasites forever endured. If a man, boldest and most intelligent of creatures, won't wander from place to place, a stranger to all, beholden to none, why would an animal, which is by temperament far more conservative, Birds are not free. A house is a compressed territory where our basic needs can be fulfilled close by and safely. So this is his perspective on zoos and how they get a sort of bad reputation or a bad press. He essentially says that animals in the wild, people perceive them as being free, but perhaps they're not so free as we might think. He says that if human beings, who are sort of the most intelligent of creatures, don't live in the wild, right? We create houses for ourselves, we have a sense of stability. Why would an animal then want to sort of be completely in the wild, not have a sense of stability? So that's his argument that he provides here. And he even says birds are not free, which is a really interesting statement. Once again, it really shows us how Pi is a thinker. He is always thinking about different things and definitely very mature for his age, I would say. Certain illusions about freedom plague them both. This is his comment about religion and about animals in the zoo. The most dangerous animal in the zoo is man. So this is what his father educates him about. The cruelty is often more active and direct. We have an obsession with putting ourselves at the center of everything, is the bane of not only theologians but also zoologists. So I thought this was such a clever line because it is very true. So he talks about theologians, people who study religion, theology, and zoologists, people who study animals. And he says that we have a tendency to put ourselves, being human beings, at the center of all these things, when in reality we are just one sort of aspect of religion and one aspect of, the natural world. I learned a lesson that an animal is an animal. Tigers are very dangerous. This is when father teaches Ravi and Pi about the dangers of tigers and dangers of animals. He really purposefully teaches them this lesson because growing up on the zoo, he wants to ensure that his children are safe. I may have anthropomorphized the animals till they spoke fluent English, but the fancy was always conscious. So he says, yes, sometimes, I did make friends with the animals, I did see them a little bit as human, but he does say that he always kept it conscious, that he wasn't unconsciously treating them as animals, that he knew that in his little sort of ways and which he was anthropomorphizing them, he knew it wasn't true. He knew that the animal was still an animal. As he says, but I never deluded myself as to the real nature of my playmates. My poking nose had more sense than that. I don't know if I saw blood before turning into mother's arms, or if I daubed it on later in my memory with a big brush. So this is how, after he sees that father feeds the tiger, he doesn't know if there was actually blood or if he's put it on in his memory. And this is important to the theme of memory as well, because something to think about with this book is this all sort of recollection of memory, right? And how great is our memory? Do we add on things? Do we take away things? How good can our memories be? Life, or in terms of being compared to the reality of the moment, life will defend itself no matter how small it is. Every animal is ferocious and dangerous. Getting animals used to the presence of humans is at the heart of the art and science of zookeeping. The key aim is to diminish an animal's flight distance. This is really important for part 2. This is the idea of when you run a zoo, you have to ensure that the people are going to be able to get to a certain distance to the animal without the animal freaking out. And that's the same sort of strategy that Pi applies with Richard Parker in the lifeboat, life raft situation. He has to condition him to, when he's in a certain proximity, to not bother him and to not be affronted by his presence. All living things contain a measure of madness that moves them in strange ways, sometimes inexplicable ways. This madness can be saving. It is part and parcel of the ability to adapt. Without it, no species would survive. If you took the whole city of Tokyo and turned it upside down and shook it, you would be amazed with the animals that would fall out. And here he talks about the circus, and the circus is important because we're going to see Pi's version of the circus in the Pacific. He establishes that the ring is his territory. Only the trainer better make sure he always remains super alpha. Social rank is essential to how it lives its life. When two creatures meet, one that is able to intimidate its opponent is recognized as socially superior, so that a social decision does not always depend on a fight. An encounter in some circumstances may be enough. Socially inferior animals are the ones that make the most strenuous, resourceful efforts to get to know their keepers. Zoomorphism, when an animal takes a human being or another animal to be one of its kind. That measure of madness that moves life in strange but saving ways. That fiction guarantees their social well-being. So here he's talking about circus trainers and how you have to remain the super alpha. And it's not even about fighting against the animal that you're training, but it's about maintaining that position and maintaining that sense of confidence, which we're definitely going to see illustrated in part 2 of the novel. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be focusing on part 2 of the novel Life of Pi, particularly Pi's time as a castaway. And so I've split this part 2 into 4 different sections, and today we're going to work on the first section, which are the characters. So the way that we're going to go through it is just like we did part 1. I've collected some quotes which I think are important to know if you're planning to write an essay on Life of Pi, and we are going to discuss some of those quotes. So we're not really talking about the plot, we're more talking about the characters themselves and how they link to potential themes and fundamental questions. So definitely you have to read the novel first, and then you can watch this video to sort of get an analysis or insight into these characters that pop up in Pi's time as a castaway. So firstly, I've grouped together the 3 animals that don't really last too long right at the start of part 2. So the zebra being first. The zebra was being eaten alive from the inside, so recall sort of the plot line of that story. And I think the use of the zebra, or the storyline of the zebra, just alerts Pi to the fact that he's sort of in this animalistic world now, and he has to fend for himself, and he sees the zebra. And something he notices, which I think I've put later on under my section on Pi, but I think this very barbaric thing that he sees of the zebra being eaten from the inside out is really traumatizing. But something that Pi says is that it would have been more traumatizing if he had not been experiencing trauma at the same time. So he couldn't have too much empathy for the zebra because he was struggling himself to survive. So that's an interesting thing about perspective. Then we have the hyena. This is a really interesting one because initially Pi is really afraid of this hyena because he doesn't realize that the tiger is there. He doesn't realize that Richard Parker's there, and so his whole perspective once again shifts between when he realizes that Richard Parker is there. He completely then is not afraid of the hyena. I was no longer afraid of it. So beforehand, this is like the sort of alpha predator on board. Well, that's what Pi thinks until he realizes Richard Parker's there. So when he realizes the tiger's there, I was no longer afraid of it. To be afraid of this ridiculous dog when there was a tiger about was like being afraid of splinters when trees are falling down. So there's a nice little simile to describe that. The hyena died neither whining nor whimpering, and Richard Parker killed without a sound. So that's the hyena's demise. Orange juice. This is maybe the most interesting of these 3 because orange juice is an animal that Pi knows, and he remembers from her time at the zoo. He knows her whole story, and also because of orangutans' likeness to humans, he feels a lot of empathy towards her. She remained gentle and unaggressive her whole life. All my life I had known only a part of her. And this he talks about when the orangutan goes and fights the hyena. He had only known this part of her as being unaggressive, but then he sees sort of this other side to her. An orangutan may be taller, may have very strong and agile arms and long canines, but if it doesn't know how to use these as weapons, they are of little use. The hyena, with only its jaws, will overcome the ape because it knows what it wants and how to get it. To the end, she reminded me of us. Her eyes expressed fear in such a human-like way, as did her strained whimpers. So I think that of all of these animals, the orange juice or the orangutan really is, an important loss that Pi experiences that impacts him later on in the novel. Okay, then we need to talk about Pi, and I've specifically labeled this Pi's mindset because obviously we're going to discuss Pi in every single part. We discussed him in part 1, what we know about him, and here I'm just quoted a bunch of the things that are going through his head as he's going through part 2 and what his mindset is. And a lot of this has to do with his survival mindset, but also you're going to see the difference between, or the way that he balances hope and reason, or faith and rationality. And that's a very important theme, which I'm definitely going to discuss when we get to the themes video. But We can see it in his mindset as well. And this is why Pi is so successful why he is successful and why he survives, is because he combines these two ideas. If he had just had faith, then he probably wouldn't have survived. If he had just had reason, he also probably wouldn't have survived. So putting them together is what actually sets him apart and allows him to survive. Things didn't turn out the way they were supposed to, but what can you do? You must take life the way it comes at you and make the best of it. I mean, I think this is a very big understatement. If I remember correctly, this is right at the end of part 1, just before we get to part 2. And Pi basically says his life didn't turn out exactly how he wanted, which I think would be an understatement because his whole life has been turned around. It was shock inactivity. Something in me did not want to give up on life, was unwilling to let go, wanted to fight until the very end. So this is when he's initially, cast away, and he doesn't really know why he's fighting to live, but there's just something innate within him that I think we all really have, is that not to give up and to try and to survive. No matter the odds, you try and you try to survive. I only had to ensure my survival for the next few hours until the rescue ship came. This is really important for his mindset, because early on, the initial few days, the reason why Pi survives is because he has hope, because he thinks that there's going to be a ship that's come save him. He thinks that someone knows that he's there, and that's what keeps him going. And that's going to be a major turning point and a major change, or a major indicator of Pi's transformation, is when he actually decides, or he recognizes and realizes, oh, no one's coming to save me. If I want to live, I've got to have to survive myself. So that's a big shift. But the first few days, he thinks that he's going to be rescued. I will beat the odds, as great as they are. I have survived so far, miraculously. Now I will turn miracle into routine. The amazing will be seen every day. I will put all the work necessary. Yes, so long as God is with me, I will not die. I discovered at that moment that I had a fierce will to live. I was feeling faint with fear. A tiger abroad, and I had waited 3 days and 3 nights to save my life. So these last 2 quotes I feel like are really important, because I think if you look at Pi, or if you just read a summary of the story, you're like, oh wow, Pi was really brave and he was fearless. But that's not true. I think why Pi is such an interesting character is because he's really human. And I think we spoke about that in the previous video as well, with his take on religion and atheism, and how we go to the lengths that we can, and then we of reason, and then we take the leap. And here the same sort of thing is, he's not fearless. He does feel fear. He's berates himself. He hasn't done anything about this tiger for 3 days and 3 nights. He is fearful, but he deals with that fear, and that's what ensures his survival. Every hair on me was standing up, shrieking with fear. The raft business was far too precarious. It only needed a shark to bite the rope, or a knot to become undone, or a large wave to crash upon me, and I would be lost. So you see, he is paranoid, he is fearful, but he deals with that, and he still acts. My options were limited to perching above a tiger or hovering over sharks. So this really emphasizes his situation, his precarious situation. Barely grateful to be still alive. It was Richard Parker who calmed me down. It is the irony of the story that the one who scares me witless to start with was the very same who brought me peace, purpose, I dare say even wholeness. This is such an important quote, because it is so important to the fundamental theme and what this is all about. And it's essentially saying to us that and the irony is when it's the opposite of what is expected occurs. So you would expect the tiger to impede his survival, but actually having the tiger on board allows Pi to survive, because it gives him purpose, it gives him something to do and something to worry about, as opposed to the other things that he could have been worrying about if he didn't have Richard Parker. And it cures his loneliness. So that is the irony of the story, is that Richard Parker is actually key to his survival, not a threat to his survival. I will tell you a secret. A part of me was glad about Richard Parker. A part of me did not want Richard Parker to die at all, because if he died, I would be left alone with despair, a foe even more formidable than a tiger. If I still had the will to live, it was thanks to Richard Parker. He kept me from thinking too much about my family and my tragic circumstances. He pushed me to go on living. I hated him for it, yet at the same time, I was grateful. I am grateful. It's the plain truth. Without Richard Parker, I wouldn't be alive today to tell you my story. I had to stop hoping so much that a ship would rescue me. I should not count on outside help. Survival had to start with me. In my experience, a castaway's worst mistake is to hope too much and do too little. Survival starts by paying attention to what is close at hand and immediate. To look out with idle hope is tantamount to dreaming one's life away. So this is what I spoke about earlier, about this transformation, about the shift. He realizes, okay, now I actually have to ensure my own survival. No one's going to help me. There was much I had to do. I looked at the empty horizon. There was so much water, and I was all alone, all alone. I burst into hot tears. I buried my face in my crossed arms and sobbed. My situation was patently hopeless. Once again, the humanness of Pi's character really allows us to connect with him. With just one glance, I discovered that the sea is a city, just below me, all around, unsuspected by me, were highways, boulevards, streets, and roundabouts bustling with submarine traffic. And this is something really powerful about Pi, is how he notices things and how he makes comments about them. And he's in a very sort of mature way. And he comments here on how the ocean, he's actually not alone. This is this entire city beneath him. He just never realized it before. And maybe human beings don't realize it because we just sort of go on the ocean just to get from A to B. And he's saying, wow, it's actually incredible. There's so many things going on. There's so much wildlife, so many interesting things beneath the water. What delusion was I under that I thought I could outwit him? Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Okay, sorry, I skipped ahead there. The first quote, this is when he's sort of doubting his stance on Richard Parker, and when we get to discussing Richard Parker, we'll chat about how he goes about training him and what his thoughts are in doing that. But he does second guess himself. And then the next few quotes, let's just read them through, and these talk about his first time fishing. Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Tears flowing down my cheeks, I egged myself on. I wept heartily over this poor little deceased soul. It was the first sentient being I had ever killed. I was now a killer. I was as guilty as Cain. I was 16 years old, a harmless boy, bookish and religious, and now I had blood on my hands. It's a terrible burden to carry. All sentient life is sacred. I'll never forget to include this fish in my prayers. Now that it was dead, the flying fish looked like fish I'd seen the markers upon a cherry. It was something else, something outside the essential scheme of creation. So for Pi, to kill this fish, this first fish, is a really big deal because he is vegetarian, he's a pacifist, right? So he hates any sort of violence, and it's really difficult for him. And the irony is that he takes so long to kill this fish that he actually prolongs the fish's trouble and suffering more than he has to. And the fact that he still thinks about it to this day really shows how sensitive he is and how, how committed he is to his values. And even though he recognizes in this moment he has to kill the fish because otherwise he will not survive, even looking back on it, he retains those values of vegetarianism and of, peace all the way. When he's done with his survival, he keeps those same values when he's older. A person can get used to anything, even to killing. Isn't that such a powerful statement? I survived 227 days. That's how long my trial lasted, over 7 months. I kept myself busy. That was one key to my survival. On a lifeboat, even on a raft, there's always something that needs doing. Mornings were usually better than the late afternoons, when the emptiness of time tended to make itself felt. So this is really insignificant. Well, it is really significant because this shows us how he survived as well. And what he does is he creates a routine for himself. He makes sure that he stays busy. He makes sure that he has something to do. And in that way, he doesn't think about his trauma the whole time or think about all the terrible things. And so this is also, remember I spoke about reason and rationality being important. And this is something that he realizes that he needs to keep busy in order to stay sane and to survive. And that's what he does. But there were more to my dealings with him than strictly necessary. I also spent hours observing him because it was a distraction. So here talk about Richard Parker and how he helps him not just, he doesn't just threaten him. He actually helps him. He's a distraction. Pi watches him. My story started on a calendar day, July 2nd, 1977, and ended on a calendar day, February 14th, 1978. But in between there was no calendar. I did not count the days or the weeks or the months. Time is an illusion that only makes us pant. I survived because I forgot even the very notion of time. This is so important because we're going to talk about how Pi transforms to become more like Savage as he goes longer and longer, being away from civilized society and being on the ocean with a tiger. And this is really interesting about time itself. And time is a construct, right? It's something that we humans have created to feel sort of in control. But when you're out on the water with no hope of survival or of being rescued, time sort of falls away. It's also significant because it points to like whether the story is actually true, almost, because it's all his recollections, but it's not like he actually knew the date. So we don't actually know how far into the journey things happen, or if it's exactly this and this day, or how long it took before he realized this and this thing, because it is his memory. What I remember are events and encounters and routines, markers that emerged here and there from the ocean of time and imprinted themselves on my memory. My memories come in a jumble. So here talking about his memories and how the story that we're reading, as much as we want to believe every word of it, maybe he's focused too much on one thing and left out another thing because it's just using his memories. He didn't have any notion of time while he was alone in the middle of the Pacific. My greatest wish, other than salvation, was to have a long book with a never-ending story, one I could read again and again, with new eyes and a fresh understanding each time. So he was bored. Words scratched on a page trying to capture reality that overwhelmed me. So he does find this notebook and he tries to write things down. But as he says, it's like an indescribable experience. So trying to like put what he's feeling and put what he's doing and what his situation is down on paper is really difficult. The rain chilled me to the bone, but I was smiling. I remember that close encounter with electrocution and third-degree burns as one of the few times during my ordeal where I felt genuine happiness. So this is speaking about a moment of danger, and we could talk about later in the themes video about how he remarks how like death is something that actually keeps you going and keeps you sort of excited about life. And that's a really interesting idea, because in that moment he feels the most alive because he's escaped death yet again. At moments of wonder, it is easy to avoid small thinking, to entertain thoughts that span the universe. We perished away. It happened slowly, so that I didn't notice it all the time. So now we're going into the sort of latter part when him and Richard Parker are really struggling. This is when they're going to encounter the blind Frenchman, because at this point both Richard Parker and Pi have become extremely weakened by their ordeal. And Pi does have moments where he really does lose hope. It's no use. Today I die. I will die today. I die. This was the last entry. I went on from there, endured, but without noting it. Do you see these invisible spirals on the margins of the page? I thought I would run out of paper. It was the pens that ran out. Such a powerful statement. He's written down, and he kept thinking he's going to run out of space. He's going to run out of pages. So he's been writing in the margins. But something unexpected happens. He ran out of his pen. And isn't that like the story of his whole thing? He thought he was going to Canada with his family, landed up being a castaway for over 200 days on the Pacific Ocean. By the next morning, I'd lost all fear of death, and I resolved to die. So you can see the hopelessness, the idea of he starts off with this fierce will to live, but this journey takes its toll on him and on his mental health as well, and his sanity. The rest of the story is nothing but grief, ache, and endurance. So that's an understanding of the last part of the journey being extremely difficult. And as much as the first part of the journey he was dealing with loss, the second part of the journey is also difficult. He is extremely weak and exhausted from this ordeal, both physically and mentally. Okay, so now let's talk about Richard Parker, really important character. The hunter whose name was Richard Parker, so that's how Richard Parker got his name, because it does sound like a human's name, because it is. There was a mix-up on the paperwork. He took up over a third of the length of the ship he was on. So that really shows us what Pi is dealing with. A really, really huge animal on this lifeboat, and a dangerous one at that. And the reason why he hasn't been, but he didn't bug Pi for the first 3 days, is this combination of sedation and seasickness. He was incredibly muscular, incomparably beautiful. So this is Pi noticing him and sort of assessing the situation. And then this is when Pi has all these thoughts. And he thinks to himself, how is he going to get rid of Richard Parker? What are the different ideas? And he goes through all these different ideas of how he can possibly get rid of him. And every time he tries one, he comes with a comeback of like he has a conversation in his head. It's like, oh shoot, no, that won't work. Oh no, this won't work. And then he eventually, let's actually read it and then I'll tell you what he eventually settles on. push him off the lifeboat. Then he thinks, hold on, tigers are accomplished swimmers. Kill him with the 6 morphine syringes. And then he's like, hold on, is that going to actually do anything to him? Or is he just going to knock him out for a little bit? Attack him with all available weaponry. And then he's like, hold on, for if there's one thing that's more dangerous than a healthy animal, it's an injured animal. Then he has these ideas to choke him, poison him, set him on fire, electrocute him. But he realizes that none of those are actually feasible. He can't actually kill the tiger that way. He doesn't have those tools, and it would be too dangerous. And then he decides on waging a war of attrition. All I had to do was let the unforgiving laws of nature run their course and I would be saved. And this is his thoughts, and he continues, but no animal, however mighty, can do without water for an extended period of time. And then he realizes, no, hold on, this sort of tiger, they're known to drink saline water, so that's not going to work. And then Pi realizes the next day that the only thing he's going to do, the plan he has to go on, is plan number 7, to keep him alive. And he recognizes that he needs to train Richard Parker, and the only way for him to sort of be safe with Richard Parker is to actually keep him alive. He backed off and dropped to the bottom of the boat. The first training session was over. It was a resounding success. I stopped whistling and sat down heavily on the raft, out of breath and exhausted. And so it came to be. Plan number 7, keep him alive. What a stunning creature. With feline speed, he had leapt across the lifeboat and struck me. It was right I needed, the sort of rights that came with might. It was time to impose myself and carve out my territory. So now he's going to really make sure that he trains Richard Parker properly, and he uses all his knowledge that we discussed in part 1 to assist him. Obviously he's never done this before, but he uses that sort of knowledge. And something to notice, why he needs to carve out territory is because he's built this raft that attaches to the lifeboat, but the raft is a lot more flimsy, and he recognizes that there's going to come a point when the weather's bad or something happens and he's going to have to go onto the lifeboat where Richard Parker is. And he needs to make sure that Richard Parker is obviously not going to attack him when that time comes, that he will stay on his side of the lifeboat. So he needs to carve out his territory on the lifeboat, so when he needs to, he can climb aboard. Be sure not to break eye contact. Once your animal has trespassed upon your territory, be unflagging in your outrage. Treatment should be repeated until the association in the animal's mind between the sound of the whistle, the feeling of intense incapacitating nausea, is fixed and totally unambiguous. Tigers, indeed all animals, do not favour violence as a means of settling scores. When animals fight, it was the intent to kill, and with the understanding that they might be killed. A clash is costly. So here he sort of presents it as though he's giving an instruction manual on how to train an animal, which is quite humorous. And he basically tells us how he's conditioning Richard Parker into not going into Pi's territory, into staying in his place. And he says that tigers do not automatically want to engage in fights, but they do that sort of as a last resort. 4 times he struck me with his right paw and sent me overboard, and 4 times I lost my shield. Eventually I learned to read the signals he was sending me. My 5th shield lasted me the rest of his training. It was not good zookeeping I was up to, but psychological bullying. So this talks about how, do you see how much of a distraction this is for Pi, and how he's able to distract himself by training Richard Parker? Obviously it's incredibly dangerous, but it still allows, I mean, I know we talk about Richard Parker here and what happens to him, but we have to focus on Pi being the human, and having complex thoughts, and how Richard Parker's existence really helps him. It was clear he was in a crouch and he was making to attack me. It was too late to get away, too late even to blow my whistle. So he conditions Richard Parker, when he hears the whistle, to feel the sense of nausea and seasickness. In a moment of insanity brought on by hunger, because I was more set on eating than I was staying alive, I looked Richard Parker dead in the eye. Suddenly his brute strength meant only moral weakness. It was nothing compared to the strength of my mind. I stared into his eyes, wide-eyed and defiant, and we faced off. Any zookeeper will tell you that a tiger, indeed any cat, will not attack in the face of a direct stare, but will wait until the deer, the antelope, or wild ox has turned its eyes. So here once again we see Pi's knowledge of the animal world helping him out, but also how he has this moment where it's almost testing to see whether Richard Parker has actually taken to the training, and he stares him down. For 2, perhaps 3 seconds, a terrific battle of minds for status and authority was waged between a boy and a tiger. He needed to make only the shortest of lunges to be on top of me, but I held my stare. I had won. I gasped with disbelief. So Richard Parker, is really physically strong, right? But Pi is mentally strong, and being, having rationality and being able to train Richard Parker and win this sort of situation where he is, in inverted commas, trespassed on his territory. This is, a really significant moment for Pi. He feels a great sense of relief and a sense that there is hope. I was still, from that day onwards, I felt my mastery was no longer in question, and I began to spend progressively more time on the lifeboat. I was still scared of Richard Parker, but only when it was necessary. His simple presence no longer strained me. You can get used to anything. Haven't I already said that? Isn't that what all survivors say? Now, Richard Parker also respects Pi because he was the source of food and water. My agency was pure and miraculous. It conferred power upon me. Proof. I remained alive day after day, week after week. Proof. He did not attack me, even when I was asleep on the tarpaulin. Proof. I am here to tell you the story. I had to give quickly and generously. This is talking after he catches fish. He has to feed Richard Parker very quickly, very generously. My eyes expressed longing, hurt, anguish, loneliness. All he was aware of that something stressful and momentous had happened, something beyond the outer limits of his understanding. He did not see that it was salvation barely missed. He only saw the alpha here. This odd, unpredictable tiger had been very excited. So here we talk about a moment of disappointment Pi has, and he tries to share that with Richard Parker, and he knows that Richard Parker is an animal. He doesn't understand exactly what has happened, but still, there's a sense of connection that Richard Parker has understood some aspect of what Pi is going through. I love you. The words burst out pure and unfettered, infinite. The feeling flooded my chest. Truly, I do. I love you, Richard Parker. If I didn't have you now, I don't know what I would do. I don't think I would make it. No, I wouldn't. I would die of hopelessness. Don't give up, Richard Parker. Don't give up. I'll get you to land. I promise. I promise. I mean, there's your proof for how Richard Parker kept him alive and how much Richard Parker meant to Pi. I began to imitate Richard Parker in sleeping an incredible number of hours. It wasn't proper sleep, but a state of semi-consciousness in which daydreams and reality were nearly indistinguishable. I made much use of my dream rag. So this is speaking about how Richard Parker, takes all these long breaks or long rests because there's nothing really to do on the lifeboat, and Pi starts to mimic that. Remember, beforehand he was very much in his routine, but then he gets weaker and tired and he starts mimicking Richard Parker in this way, and he uses his dream rag. Remember, the dream rag is his way to sort of hallucinate and have sort of dreams to pass the time. Weak and ill-tempered, I'm so weak. If he attacks, I won't be able to defend myself. Simply do not have the energy to blow whistle. So we can see here Pi's state and how he becomes weaker and weaker. And he gets to a point where they're so weak that Pi is able to even touch Richard Parker, and there's no sort of repercussions. We were slow eaters now. So do you see how, as it goes from earlier, it's very much like Pi is different to Richard Parker, and then as it goes, as they become weaker and weaker in the last few chapters, they become together. So now we were slow eaters. Before they used to eat their food quickly. Now they both eat slowly. So it's the sense of togetherness. They've sort of grown this connection, and they're both struggling together. I came to the sad conclusion that I could no longer take care of Richard Parker. I had failed as a zookeeper. I was more affected by his imminent demise than I was by my own. But truly broken down and wasted away as I was, I could do no more for him. I closed my eyes and waited for my breath to leave my body. I muttered, "Goodbye, Richard Parker. I'm sorry for I failed you. I did my best. Farewell. Dear father, dear mother, dear Ravi, greetings. Your loving son and brother is coming to meet you. Not an hour has gone by I haven't thought of you. The moment I see you will be the happiest of my life. And now I leave matters in the hands of God, who is love and whom I love." I laughed. I knew it. I wasn't hearing voices. I hadn't gone mad. It was Richard Parker who was speaking to me. The carnivorous rascal. All this time together he had chosen an hour before we were going to die to pipe up. I was elated to be on speaking terms with the tiger. I was certain he would turn away. He would look at me. He would flatten his ears. He would growl. In some such way, he would conclude our relationship. He did nothing of the sort. He only looked fixedly into the jungle. Then Richard Parker, companion of my torment, awful, fierce thing that kept me alive, moved forward and disappeared forever from my life. I struggled to shore and fell upon the sand. I looked about. I was truly alone, orphaned not only of my family, but now of Richard Parker, and nearly, I thought, of God. This last quote is incredibly powerful because Richard Parker's connection with Pi is very clear, And we can see that Pi is absolutely traumatized by the fact that Richard Parker doesn't even sort of acknowledge their ordeal together, and he just goes away into the jungle when they arrive in Mexico. And this is really significant because, what we said right at the beginning in the part 1 video about how Pi learns not to anthropomorphize animals, right? To see them as animals. And he recognizes this, but after spending all this time with Richard Parker and building that connection, having gone through so many things together, he's sort of in his head, he's made Richard Parker out. He talks to him, he has conversations with him to be more human than perhaps was healthy. But at the same time, it was really important to have had Richard Parker. But Pi in the when he's in Canada and talking to the author, he's still traumatized and tormented by the fact that Richard Parker didn't even say goodbye. It's this really deep connection that he had with the tiger, and because he was the only one to really understand what he was going through. So even though Pi recognizes that Richard Parker is an animal and that he can't possibly give him the same sort of empathy and the same sort of connection or reaction that you would expect from a human connection, he still feels really deeply for him and is very traumatized by this send-off. And lastly, let's talk about the blind Frenchman. So let's go through it sort of literally in terms of what the blind Frenchman, what the interaction is all about. So the blind Frenchman, they meet in the middle of the ocean. This is at the time where Pi is also blind from sort of being weak and starving. Please answer me, what is it? I'm blind and we have no food and water, but we have each other. That is something precious. So what is it, my dear brother? I am too blind. He wailed again. I was struck dumb. I had met another blind man on another lifeboat in the Pacific. He was close by. He was far away. He was to my left. He was to my right. He was ahead of me. He was behind me. This was a terrible cost of Richard Parker. He gave me a life, my own, but at the expense of taking one. He ripped the flesh off the man's frame and cracked his bones. The smell of blood filled my nose. Something in me died then that has never come back to life. So this talks about how they meet this blind Frenchman on a raft. He comes aboard Pi's ship and he tries to kill Pi because he's starving, and Richard Parker steps in and kills him, and Pi is traumatized by this. I found he had lied to me because the Frenchman had said that he didn't have any food. He had a little turtle meat, a dorado head, and even a supreme treat, some biscuit crumbs, and he had water. It all went into my mouth. I returned to my boat and released his, crying as I had done my eyes some good. Crying had done my eyes some good. The small window at the top left of my vision opened a crack. I rinsed my eyes with the seawater. With every rinsing, the window opened further. My vision came back within 2 days. I will confess that I caught one of his arms with a gaff and used his flesh as bait. I will further confess that driven by the extremity of my need and the madness which had pushed me, I ate some of his flesh. I mean small pieces, little strips that I meant for the gaff's hook that when dried by the sun looked like ordinary animal flesh. They slipped into my mouth nearly unnoticed. You must understand, my suffering was unremitting and he was already dead. I stopped as soon as I caught a fish. I pray for his soul every day. So here we can see Pi's descent into savagery. So this is a good example if you want to show that he does sort of become more animalistic, and he even eats a little bit of this man's flesh. He obviously didn't kill him, but he does eat some of the flesh. And he is able to actually see again after a couple of days. Now, this is a very sort of literal thing, so if you're answering questions on the Blind Frenchman story, then that gives you an indication of the story. But in terms of figurative, to me it seems very unrealistic for him to have met an actual blind Frenchman. I feel like, in my opinion, this is a representation of something within Pi dying. And he says there's something in me died that has never come back to life. He had to give up on something in that moment, like he'd reached the lowest of all lows. He is blind in the middle of the ocean, and he had to let go of some aspect of himself in order to survive. So to me, I see this in a very figurative manner, but obviously you need to be aware of the literal as well. So it's like Pi giving up in the figurative sense. He's giving up his almost a sense of his humanity, and he's leaning into this sort of animalistic part of himself, because he's going to need that for the last push in his survival. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found the video helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be looking at the second part of what I've termed as Pi's time as a castaway, we're going to be looking at the themes that are apparent in this section of the book. So please remember to read the novel first. This is an analysis of some of the key themes through some of the important quotes. So the first theme that is really, really significant is survival. And I did talk a little bit about this in the previous video, but one of the keys to Pi's survival is the fact that he balances reason with faith. So he is really religious, as we spoke about in the first video, in part 1. And his faith in God, or in all the different religions that he believes in, really keeps him going because it allows him to stay sane in in his mental state. It gives him a routine in terms of his praying times, and it allows him to have hope. But at the same time, he would not have survived if he had just sat there and prayed. He also has reason to back up his survival. And so he needed reason in terms of figuring out how to train Richard Parker, right? Otherwise he would have died very much sooner. He also needed to figure out how to fish. He needed to figure out how to filter water. He needed to figure out all these different things that involved reason and rationality to live. So in that very first part, we spoke about the two Mr. Kumars, and we can see that come through in his survival, is that he needs these two aspects in his life. He needs the faith and the hope, but he also needs reason and rationality and action. So notice that as we go through in terms of this theme of survival. This net would become one of my most precious possessions. So right at the beginning, this net comes onto or near the lifeboat. At the time, he doesn't recognize its importance, but in due course, when he is stuck there for so long, for 227 days, it becomes very useful. The idea of orange juice stirring was too much for my nerves to bear, so I did not consider it. So sometimes, in order to survive, you just have to ignore certain things. The night passed, minute by slow minute. With the very first rays of light, it came alive in me. Hope. As things emerged in outline and filled with colour, hope increased until it was like a song in my heart. Oh, what it was to bask in it. Things would work out yet. The worst was over. I had survived the night. Today I would be rescued. To think that, to string those words together in my mind, was itself a source of hope. Hope fed on hope. So remember that the first few days he survives because he thinks he's going to be rescued. And so once he gets through the first night, he sort of like clambers down and just tries to survive the night because he thinks he's going to be rescued the next day. And then over time, over the next few days, when he realizes that's not the case, that's when he finally actually gets up and figures, okay, if I'm going to survive, I have to find some water, I have to find some food, I have to figure out this tiger situation. So for the first few days, he's very passive actually. He's sitting there, he's just trying to get through past the time, because he thinks he's going to be saved. And that's important to his survival in those first few days because he has this hope. But then later on, he has to change gears in order to continue to survive. I raised my hands to the level of my chest, the weapons I had against the hyena. So he is so thirsty and so desperate that he has to walk past the hyena. He can't just sit there and wait for someone to rescue him. He realizes this, so he raises his fist, which is sort of a humorous image, to raise your fist against a hyena, but he's really to focus on his survival, he needs to go after water. Of hunger and thirst is the greater imperative. I did not grasp all these details and many more right away. They came to my notice with time and as a result of necessity. When some small thing, some detail, would transform itself and appear in my mind in a new light. How true it is that necessity is the mother of invention. How very true. So this is when he actually sees the water and sees the food and all the supplies. He doesn't notice everything and what it's going to be used for. As he continues in his survival journey, he uses different things at different times, and he recognizes their value in different ways. So this really shows also Pi's sort of humanity. Remember, he's a 16-year-old boy. He's not trained in any sort of survival techniques or even ocean navigating or anything like that. So everything sort of comes to him. He's sort of doing this, he's figuring it out as he goes. As the lid opened, it became a barrier that closed off 12 inches of open space between tarpaulin and bench, through which Richard Parker could get to me after pushing aside the life jackets. Such a push would both warn me and help me fall backwards into the water with the lifebuoy. The delight of the manufactured good, the man-made device, the created thing. So as he opens the locker door, he realizes that it creates a barrier, so he's actually protected from Richard Parker, and he'll be warned if Richard Parker comes. So he thinks of all these things. As he's trying to get food and water, he thinks of all these potential dangers, because he's not just surviving on the ocean, but he's also trying to survive from a tiger. and he finds these manufactured goods, these rations. Aching expectation has run its fruitful course. I had to drink now, or I would die. And he calls water liquid life. Everything in me, right down to the pores of my skin, was expressing joy. So now he's had water and he feels like a new person. My right hand started twitching. It reached and nearly touched the delicious flattened balls of parboiled rice in my imagination. It sank its fingers in the steaming hot flesh. It formed balls soaked with sauce. It brought it to my mouth. I chewed. Oh, it was exquisitely painful. This is when he's imagining the food that he would like to eat. Given the exceptional circumstances, the vegetarian part of me would simply pinch its nose and bear it. And so this is what I'm talking about with reason, right? Is that he realizes that he can't stay a vegetarian while on this lifeboat. He has to actually make some compromises in order to survive. So I had water rations to last me 124 days. I was so sorely in need of company and comfort that the attention brought to making each one of these mass-produced goods felt like a special attention paid to me. I repeatedly mumbled, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." So these are the early days of his survival, where he's still getting accustomed to this isolation, this loneliness. After a thorough investigation, I made a complete list. So you see his rationality, his reason coming through. It's going to be responsible for his survival. I built a raft. If for some reason it did not float, I was as good as dead. The fish scattered except for the sharks. So when he builds this raft, because he realizes he can't stay on the lifeboat or the Toplin with Richard Parker, he needs to have somewhere else with which to view him, and he builds this raft, but he's no builder or anything. He doesn't have any experience, and he realizes that if it fails, then he's as good as dead. Also, the mention of the sharks just shows like he really can't catch a break from anything. He's got sharks underneath them, a tiger on board. He's in the middle of nowhere. Heavy drops of fresh water plop loudly and wastefully into the sea. So that's just a note on perspective and perception. To him now, who's has these water rations, the rain seems very wasteful. But to us, we wouldn't maybe consider it. We would just think, oh, it's raining. So just noting how different situations that you're in produce different sort of perceptions of the world. I had to tame him. It was at that moment that I realized this necessity. It was not a question of him or me, but of him and me. We were, literally and figuratively, in the same boat. We would live, or we would die together. He might be killed in an accident, or he could die shortly of natural causes, but it would be foolish to count on such an eventuality. More likely the worst would happen, the simple passage of time, in which his animal toughness would easily outlast my human frailty. Only if I tamed him could I possibly trick him into dying first, if we had to come to that sorry business. So this is when he makes the decision that he needs to train Richard Parker in order for them both to survive. I had to devise a training program for Richard Parker. I had to make him understand that I was top tiger and that his territory was limited to the floor of the boat, the stern bench and the side benches as far as the middle cross bench. So he does this because he knows that at some point he's going to have to leave the raft and come into the lifeboat. And when he does, he needs to make sure that Richard Parker understands where his place is and that he will not try and attack him. I had to start fishing very soon. It would not take long for Richard Parker to finish the animal carcasses. At the zoo, the adult lions and tigers ate on average 10 pounds of meat a day. I noticed that with the raft next to it, the lifeboat had changed directions. It was no longer perpendicular to the waves, but broadside to them, and it was beginning to roll from side to side. That rolling was so unsettling for the stomach. What may seem like a detail to you was something which would save my life and which Richard Parker would come to regret. So these little details that he's noticing, as he says, they may not seem important, but they're actually really important because this allows him to train Richard Parker, allows him to make sure that he has a place on the lifeboat when he needs it, and he is going to need it. And just notice how his survival also comes from the fact that he has something to do. He has Richard Parker to keep him focused and to sort of distract him from his trauma. Otherwise, he could be sitting there and, completely just spiral out of control. Richard Parker gives him something to do. With some indefinably green and queasy in its tone, this is when he makes Richard Parker feel seasick to condition him to train him. A solar still is a device to produce fresh water from salt water. Work was slow but satisfying. It kept my mind busy. It took me a good part of the day to fix up the raft. There were many details to look after. The main rope tensed, while the security rope, which I had deliberately measured out longer, hung limply. It was a fine day. I decided to try my hand at fishing for the first time in my life. The sea moved in a lethargic way, as if it was exhausted from the oncoming heat. I think that's significant because the sea is almost like a character in the sense that it changes. So in this moment it's lethargic, but later on we'll see how the storm comes and it's completely, the water goes crazy. The storm makes the waves rise really high, and so Pi is dealing. He's not just like on a sort of nice and easy strait of water. The sea, the ocean is incredibly powerful and unpredictable. I sat against the mast. The thought of our problem. Instantly, these technological contraptions became as precious to me as cattle are to a farmer, talking about how he gets water like his solar stills. It occurred to me that with every passing day, the lifeboat was resembling a zoo enclosure more and more. Richard Parker had his sheltered area for sleeping and resting, his food stash, his lookout, and now his water hole. My clothes disintegrated, victims of the sun and salt. Salt water boils. Red, angry, disfiguring, were a leprosy of the high seas transmitted by the water that soaked me. And then he looks at the manual that has been left on the lifeboat, but a basic knowledge of seafaring was assumed by the author of the manual. I hadn't the faintest idea how the night sky might serve as a road map. I had no means of controlling where I was going, and he figures out afterwards when he talks to people that the reason why he was sort of tending in that direction was because of the Pacific Equatorial countercurrent. But obviously, a 16-year-old boy, he didn't know that. He was unaware of that. The effort seemed out of proportion to the reward. So I just want you to note how in all these different quotes, it really just shows Pi's, he doesn't just sit there and do nothing. He's really acting the whole time. He's trying to figure out how to survive. Even though he has no sort of training or understanding of what he's doing, he's constantly trying. Even though it would be very easy for him to feel helpless, right? He doesn't know how to navigate with the stars. He doesn't know what the currents are, but he tries to read this manual. He tries to figure it out, and now he's going to try and fish as well. I stuck fingers into eyes, jammed hands into gills, crushed soft stomach with knees, bit tails with my teeth. I did whatever was necessary to hold a fish down until I could reach for the hash and chop its head off. With time and experience, I became a better hunter. I grew bolder and more agile. I developed an instinct, a feel for what to do. So remember, he abandons his vegetarianism. I know actually abandons a bit of pretty strong word. He almost presses pause on it because he still lives by his values as much as he can, but he recognizes that he has to kill animals in order to survive. I wore those spots of shine and silver like tilaks, the marks of color that we Hindus wear on our foreheads as a symbol of the divine. So this is talking about when there was lots of fish and where there was moments of abundance. And just notice how, when you are in survival mode, the small moments really do stand out and they really are powerful. And so he says, as he says, these are the good days. They were rare. So they didn't happen often, but when they did, he really basked in that. I descended to a level of savagery I never imagined possible. So in his quest to survive, he has to give up a lot of his humanity and become more animalistic. They provided distraction. What I saw was an upside-down town, small, quiet, and peaceful, whose citizens went about the sweet civility of angels. The sight was a welcome relief for my frayed nerves. So this is another form of distraction. He looks beneath the ocean, and he sees this sort of city beneath it with all these animals and plants. Though I rested all the time, I rarely slept longer than an hour or so at a stretch, even at night. So thinking about that as well, just like counting how many things he has to contend with is insane. But that anxiety and that, you can never properly sleep when you're in a situation like that. It was apprehension and anxiety that roused me. On many nights I was convinced I saw a light in the distance. Each time I set off a flare. However, in time I gave up entirely on being saved by a ship, and he realizes that it's only going to be his actions that are going to save him. No, humanity and its unreliable ways could not be counted on. From a single smell, a whole town arose. So this is also a matter of survival, or a tool he uses for survival is, I think we're going to talk about later, the dream rag, which I briefly discussed in the last video as well. Like, to have these sort of hallucinations, or to think of your favorite food or your favorite moment. That's how he gets by. I drank the blood to the last drop. So there we have that sort of level of savagery again. Either I tamed him, made him see he was number one and he was number two, or I died the day I wanted to climb aboard the lifeboat during rough weather and he objected. I was continuously hungry. I thought about food obsessively. Whereas at first I gutted the fish and peeled their skin fastidiously, soon I no more than rinsed off their slimy slipperiness before biting into them, delighted to have such a treat between my teeth. By the end of my journey I was eating everything a turtle had to offer. I was at the mercy of turtle meat for smiles. So remember that this is a really good example to prove his sort of descent into savagery, or how he changes when he's on the sea, and how he, as he says, he used to fish very carefully and he used to clean the fish, and now he just eats the fish because he's become transformed. My body developed a revulsion for salt that I still experience to this day. So that shows the effect of, it's one of the examples of the effect of this venture and this ordeal on him in his later life. After just a few weeks, my body began to deteriorate. My feet and ankles started to swell, and I was finding it very tiring to stand. There were many skies, there were many seas. There's a wonderful page of writing at the start of the chapter where it's talking about there were many skies, there were many seas, and it really just emphasizes how long he's on the water for, and how, day in and day out, he only tells us sort of the highlights or the lowlights, but there's a lot of middle time that we don't really get to know. There's lots of skies, lots of seas, lots of different days where he is struggling to survive, and his survival is amplified by this, because he's able to survive not just good times and bad times, but medium times as well, which perhaps is even more difficult. Otherwise, I grew quite fond of sharks. They were like curmudgeonly old friends who would never admit that they liked me, yet came round to see me all the time. At least the flesh was tasty and unfishy, and the crunchiness of cartilage was a welcome respite from so much soft food. I know my survival is hard to believe. When I think back, I can hardly believe it myself. Those plastic bags wouldn't have been more precious to me had they contained gold, sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. I worried incessantly about them. My worst nightmare was that I would open the locker one morning and find that all three had spilled, or worse still, had split. So, this is all about how water is absolutely gold when he's on the lifeboat, when he's in the situation, and his deepest worry is that the water is going to spill, and that he's not going to have any bags to refill with more water from the solar stills. It becomes his primary obsession, and he gets paranoid about it, which is understandable. Once again, it shows us perception, right? And how in this moment in his life, in this situation, that water is so significant to him. The empty cans of water, which are now preciously kept. So remember right at the beginning when he finds the water, he throws the can over the boat. Now he keeps the cans because he's so paranoid about getting water that he needs to make sure the cans are always full. The scarcity of fresh water was the single most constant source of anxiety and suffering throughout our journey, because right at the beginning he didn't know he was going to be on the boat for so long. He still thought he was going to be rescued. I noticed with a pinching of the heart that I ate like an animal, that this noisy, frantic, unchewing wolfing down of mine was exactly the way Richard Parker ate. The bow vanished underwater. I was shocked and chilled and scared witless, but before we reached the next valley I was half drowned. For the rest of the day and into the night we went up and down, up and down, up and down, until terror became monotonous and was replaced by numbness and a complete giving up. I held onto the tarpaulin rope with one hand and the edge of the bow bench with the other, while my body lay flat against the side bench. In this position, water pouring in, water pouring out, the tarpaulin beat me to a pulp. I was soaked and chilled, and I was bruised and cut by bones and turtle shells. The noise of the storm was constant, as was Richard Parker's snarling. I was sore all over and had a bad cut on my thigh. The wound was swollen and white. I was nearly too afraid to check the contents of the locker. I took out needle and thread and went about mending the tears in the tarpaulin. So this is talking about that really terrible night of the storm, and how that experience was. He goes back to the lifeboat, but he gets injured, and you're going to see now he experiences loss as well, and it's really traumatizing for him. Another just a very particular example you could use in an essay to show his struggle is the night of the storm. And do you see how he tries to rebuild though? He takes out needle and thread. He's trying to figure out what to do next. He's always acting. One hole brought me something I'd lost. I considered it. Cradled in the palm of my hand was all that remained between me and death, the last of the orange whistles. So he loses a lot in this time, and he loses the raft. And we're going to talk about that in the next theme, which is the theme of loss, and what that means, that the loss of the raft is extremely heartbreaking for him. And he has one last orange whistle, and this is really a crazy idea, but this is literally between him and death, because if he can't control Richard Parker and he's trained him with the whistle, then Richard Parker has no reason to obey him. I broke its neck by leveraging his head backwards, one hand pushing up the beak, the other holding the neck, so you can see how much more savage he becomes. 10,000 trumpets and 20,000 drums could not have made as much noise as that bolt of lightning. It was positively deafening. But the dream rag gave a special quality to my days. It must have been the way it restricted my air intake. I would be visited by the most extraordinary dreams, trances, visions, thoughts, sensations, remembrances, and time would be gobbled up. With a twitch or gasp disturbed me and the rag fell away, I had come to full consciousness, delighted to find that time had slipped by. The dryness of the rag was part proof, but more than that was the feeling that things were different, that the present moment was different from the previous present moment. So the dream rag helps him to pass the time. He can sort of hallucinate a bit, think of other things and not his situation. Once again, another form of action. I put a message in a bottle. Japanese-owned cargo ship Tsutsuma flying Flying Panamanian flag sank July 2nd, 1977 in Pacific, 4 days out of Manila. Am in lifeboat. Piper tells my name. Have some food, some water, but Bengal tiger, serious problem. Please advise family, Winnipeg, Canada. Any help would be much appreciated. Thank you. I corked the bottle and covered the cork with a piece of plastic. I tied the plastic to the neck of the bottle with nylon string, knotting it tightly. I launched the bottle into the water. Notice here he does still have a little bit of hope for his family being alive. Everything suffered, everything became sun-bleached and weather-beaten. The lifeboat, the raft until it was lost, the tarpaulin, the stills, the rain catchers, the plastic bags, the lines, the blankets and net, all became worn, stretched, slack, cracked, dried, rotted, torn, discoloured. What was orange became whitish orange. What was smooth became rough. What was rough became smooth. What was sharp became blunt. What was whole became tattered. The sun took care of all the smells. So this is significant because this is a physical indication or physical manifestation of decay. And this is what's happening to Pi as well, is he's becoming weaker and weaker, just like all these objects around him are becoming weaker and weaker almost. My eyes started to ooze pus, then darkness came. Blink as I might. At first it was right in front of me, a black spot at the center of everything. It spread into a blotch that reached the edges of my vision. All I saw of the sun the next morning was a crack of light at the top of my left eye, like a small window too high up. By noon, everything was pitch black. I clung to life. I was weakly frantic. The heat was infernal. I had so little strength I could no longer stand. My lips were hard and cracked, my mouth was dry and pasty, coated with a glutinous saliva, as foul to taste as it was to smell. My skin was burnt, my shriveled muscles ached, my limbs, especially my feet, were swollen and a constant source of pain. I was hungry, and once again there was no food. As for water, Richard Parker was taking so much I was down to 5 spoonfuls a day. But this physical suffering was nothing compared to the moral torture I was about to endure. I would rate the day I went blind as the day of my extreme suffering began. I could not tell you when exactly in the journey it happened. Time, as I said before, became irrelevant. It must have been sometime between the 100th and 200th day. I was certain I would not last another one. So this is significant in terms of just showing us the extent of his survival. Like, you can think about survival in terms of the general thing of him surviving all this time on the sea, but also all these individual instances. If you include these in your essay, it's going to show off that you really do understand and that you've read the text. Obviously, remember, you don't tell the story in a literature essay. Definitely watch my video on how to write a literature essay. But you're not trying to tell the story, but rather you use them as examples. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention earlier, but I have a video on literature essays on how to write them, and also a video on how to integrate quotes into your literature essay. So if you're watching this and taking down quotes that you want to use, definitely have a watch of that video so you understand which quotes in particular you should be studying, because obviously you can't study all of these quotes. When he finally arrives in Mexico, he describes the people. They came up to me with their hands covering their noses and mouths, because you can just imagine being on the sea for 227 days, living like Pi was. He must have completely looked emaciated and terrible, but smelt really bad as well. Okay, moving on to the theme of loss. Obviously, Pi experiences a lot of loss, so here are just a couple of quotes that can show us the different kinds of loss he experiences. Mother, my tender guardian, angel of wisdom, where are you? And you, Father, my loving worrywart, and you, Ravi, dazzling hero of my childhood. Every single thing I value in life has been destroyed. They were dead. I could no longer deny it. What a thing to acknowledge in your heart. To lose a brother is to lose someone with whom you can share the experience of growing old, who is supposed to bring you a sister-in-law and nieces and nephews, creatures to the people of the tree of life, and give it new branches. To lose your father is to lose the one whose guidance and help you seek, who supports you like a tree trunk supports its branches. To lose your mother, well, that is like losing the sun above you. It is like losing... I'm sorry, I would rather not go on. I get teary-eyed every time I read that sentence, because it really is such an ordeal that Pi goes through, and this is right at the beginning, before even his survival. Just think about the cargo ship sinking. He's already lost so much. I thought of my family, of how they were spared this terrible agony. On the day when I estimated it was my mother's birthday, I sang happy birthday to her out loud. And so this is the first really big instance of loss, is the loss of his family, of everything that he knew. And another instance of loss is after the storm, when he loses the raft, because the raft, it was like a home to him. Yes, it was a symbol of his accomplishment. He was able to build the raft himself to keep himself alive. It was sort of a safe space for him. It had kept him alive for so long. There was all this marine life that had grown around it. And with the storm, when it vanishes, he feels this intense sense of loss. My little marine town had vanished. The loss of the raft was perhaps not fatal to my body, but it felt fatal to my spirits. So whenever we analyze a text, we usually talk about the theme of fate and versus free will. So I think there's certain elements of fate and luck that come into Pi's story, and then a lot of free will as well. I always tend to lean towards free will, but we do have to acknowledge fate. So some luck that he experiences that allows him to survive. It was a miracle I didn't hurt myself. So when he actually first gets into the lifeboat, he's thrown overboard. It's a miracle he didn't break his leg or anything. If there hadn't been the lifebuoy, I wouldn't have lasted a minute. If it weren't for the Sahina, the sailors wouldn't have thrown me into the lifeboat. So, I mean, that's all pretty lucky stuff if you think about it. The fact that he was even on the lifeboat. And then, lastly, when he is training Richard Parker and he gets thrown back into the sea, luckily there were no sharks, because there were lots of sharks throughout his ordeal. But luckily, in that moment when he's pushed off the boat, there are no sharks, and he is able to pull himself up and live. Faith and hope, this links to religion, and remember we spoke about this as a really key part of his survival, is having faith and having hope. Vishnu preserve me, Allah protect me, Christ save me. I was alone and orphaned in the middle of the Pacific, hanging onto an oar, an adult tiger in front of me, sharks beneath me, a storm raging above me. Had I considered my prospects in the light of reason, I surely would have given up and let go of the oar, hoping that I might drown before being eaten. But I don't recall that I had a single thought during those first few minutes of relative safety. I didn't even notice daybreak. I held onto the oar. I just held on. God only knows why. So once again, you can see there how it's this combination of reason and faith that allows him to survive. And in that particular moment, it was faith. If he had thought about this reasonably, he really would not have wanted to live, or he would not have persevered. Once you saved the world by taking the form of a fish, now you have saved me by taking the form of a fish. Thank you, thank you. I practiced religious rituals that I adapted to my circumstances. They brought me comfort, that is certain. But it was hard. Oh, it was hard. Faith in God is an opening up, a letting go, a deep trust, a free act of love. But sometimes it was so hard to love. Sometimes my heart was sinking so fast with anger, desolation, and weariness. I was afraid it would sink to the very bottom of the Pacific, and I would not be able to lift it back up. So talking about the troubles of faith, and once again I feel like this really shows Pi as a real sort of human figure that we can connect to, because he does struggle. He undergoes struggle even with his faith, right? Even though he's probably one of the most faith obsessed people, he does struggle being in this position to believe in God, but he also says that his belief in God allows him to live. And in this way, I would remind myself of creation and of my place in it. God's ear didn't seem to be listening. Despair was like heavy blackness that let no light in or out. It was a hell beyond expression. I thank God it always passed. This is an outbreak of divinity. The lower you are, the higher your mind will want to soar. It was a natural that, bereft and desperate as I was, in the throes of unremitting suffering, I should turn to God. There's a really wonderful line, I'm not sure why I didn't include it here, I must have included it somewhere else, where he talks about how he understands his suffering within the Hindu religion, and he puts his suffering into perspective. So when he was feeling sort of overwhelmed by his suffering and feeling really pessimistic, he then actually reframes his suffering as being just tiny in the scope of the entire universe, and that completely reframes his perspective and allows him to see his suffering for what it is, that it's finite, that it will end, and he's able to then sort of move on in a more optimistic manner. So I mean, it's a really powerful thing to be able to do, and that's what faith and hope allows him to do. We then have free will, so Pi's actions and how that ensures his survival. Didn't I have the perfect circus ring, inescapably round? Wasn't this an ideal source of treats with which to condition him to obey? Whistle, I had all the time in the world. My panic was gone. My fear was dominated. Survival was at hand. The Pi Patel Indo-Canadian Trans-Pacific Floating Circus. So all of his actions, so we spoke about in survival, of how he rations the food and the water, how he trains Richard Parker, all of these show his free will, and that Pi's survival is because of his actions, that he is responsible for his success. So we can say the combination of the fate and the free will, but to me I always lean towards free will, and you have wonderful examples to prove that. Another important theme is the suffering, both physical and mental suffering, that Pi endures. I was not wounded in any part of my body, but I had never experienced such intense pain. So when he actually he realizes his fate and he's on the lifeboat He is not physically wounded, but he realizes that he's lost. He doesn't realize the extent of what he's lost, but he's feeling a lot of suffering. It's just mental, it's not perhaps physical. He doesn't know where his family is. There's lots of uncertainty. He's worried. He's got all these animals on board. Different from the frozen anxiety of the first night and being a more conventional sort of suffering. So remember, the first night of his ordeal, he thinks that he's going to be saved. So he's just sort of like trying to hunker down and get through it. But afterwards, it becomes a more conventional sort of suffering because he realizes there might not be any salvation. The broken down kind of consisting of weeping and sadness and spiritual pain, and different from later ones in which I still had the strength to appreciate fully what I felt. It was a sight horrible to the eyes and killing to the spirit. This is when he sees the zebra being eaten from the inside out. And this is what's really significant, is when he realizes his own suffering, he says, I saw my suffering for what it was, finite and insignificant, which I think is such a powerful thing to be able to say about suffering that much. And this is how he sort of even goes on surviving, is because he recognizes that his suffering is going to come to an end, and in the broader span of the universe, that is really insignificant. When we reached land, Mexico to be exact, I was so weak I barely had the strength to be happy about it. We had great difficulty landing. I wept like a child. It was not because I was overcome at having survived my ordeal, though I was, nor was it the presence of my brothers and sisters, though that too was very moving. I was weeping because Richard Parker had left me so unceremoniously. So remember that even after, experiencing such a terrible ordeal, the ordeal itself is terrible, but the aftermath can also be terrible. And the fact that he's left without Richard Parker, and Richard Parker doesn't actually say goodbye to him properly, really, really haunts him. And then reason and rationality. So remember we said reason and rationality, faith and hope work together to ensure his survival. One terror at a time, Pacific before tiger. So he's thinking reasonably, he's thinking rationally. Okay, let me attack each of these separately. Fear and reason fought over the answer. There was not a shadow of doubt about the matter. To leave the lifeboat meant certain death. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be having a look at 2.3, what I've labelled as 2.3 here, which is regarding part 2 of the novel, and it's specifically focusing on Pi's reflections about life as he is a castaway on the Pacific, and a few of what he thinks about when he reflects on this time in his life. This is an important thing to consider because you could be asked a contextual question on this about what Pi learns from his experience or what he learns about life. And what you could also get asked is you could be asked a whole essay question about Pi's transformation, about what he learns about his experience, things like that. So understanding certain reflections, and quite a few of them are philosophical. I always feel like this novel, as you're reading, it's a combination of a novel and a sort of philosophical discussion at the same time, because there's lots of interesting and complex ideas that Pi reflects on. Why can we throw a question further? We can put in an answer. Why such a vast net if there's so little fish to catch? So he asks this, and this just emphasizes how sort of lost he feels in that moment, how there's so many questions, and sometimes how in life we have so many questions but we don't have answers. Isn't it ironic, Richard Parker, we're in hell yet we're still afraid of immortality? So here he talks about how you would expect that when you're in such a terrible situation you would really want to die, but in this case he remarks to Richard Parker how yet even though despite they're in this terrible situation, how they still have this desire to live. When your own life is threatened, your sense of empathy is blunted by a terrible selfish hunger for survival. So this is when he talks about seeing the zebra, and he is traumatized by seeing the zebra being eaten from the inside out, but he recognizes that he would be feeling much worse about this if he himself was not threatened at the moment and struggling to survive. So he has to see it sort of in perspective. I had no idea a living being could sustain so much injury and go on living. In the face of such a superior predator, all of us were prey, and normal ways of preying were effective. It seemed that the presence of the tiger had saved me from the hyena, surely a textbook example of jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So remember, he's incredibly afraid of the hyena at first, but then when he realizes there's a tiger on board, and suddenly his entire perspective changes, as do all the other animals, and they realize, oh, okay, even the hyena himself realizes that he's not the alpha here, that there's actually a tiger which is going to threaten them all. So once again, that message of like perception and perspective. Never give up. We fight and fight and fight. We fight no matter the cost of battle, the losses we take, the improbability of success. We fight to the very end. It's not a question of courage. It's something constitutional, an inability to let go. It may be nothing more than life-hungry stupidity. I must say a word about fear. It is life's only true opponent. Only fear can defeat life. It is a clever, treacherous adversary. How well I know. I think this is such a powerful statement, and he has a couple of quotes about fear, and this is what makes Pi really human, and really sort of we can empathize with him because he's this human going through this very human experience, and he's not someone who's completely confident, right? He's a 16-year-old boy in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and he feels fear, and he explains that fear, but he also goes above that fear, and he's able to rise above it and to actually act and to survive, which is really incredibly admirable, which I don't think most people can do, right? I don't think that every single person has that ability to rise above fear. But here Pi is recognizing fear and how dangerous fear can be to your survival. One moment you are feeling calm, self-possessed, happy. Then fear, disguised in the garb of mild-mannered doubt, slips into your mind like a spy. Doubt meets disbelief, and disbelief tries to push it out. Quickly you make rash decisions. You dismiss your last allies, hope and trust. There you've defeated yourself. Fear, which is but an impression, has triumphed over you. Nestles in your memory like gangrene. It seeks to rot everything. You must fight hard to shine the light of words upon it, because if you don't, if your fear becomes wordless darkness that you avoid, perhaps you may manage to forget, you open yourself to further attacks of fear, because you never truly fought the opponent who defeated you. So here is when he talks about how it's important to actually put your fears into words, because then it's something finite that you can conquer. But if you let fear become wordless in the sort of pit of darkness, then you haven't defined it, and therefore you cannot overcome it. Be daunted, but not defeated. If you have the will to live, you will. The pain was so severe, I felt nothing. That's an example of a paradox. Time became distance for me in the way that it is for all mortals. To be a castaway is to be a point perpetually at the center of a circle. To be a castaway is to be caught in a harrowing ballet of circles. You're at the center of one circle while above you two opposing circles spin about. So this is like, just imagine, put yourself in Pi's shoes. He's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's just water from end to end. And it's almost like the circle, because this is a never-ending cycle. And he can't see anything beyond it, in terms of literally, but also figuratively. When it is light, the openness of the sea is blinding and frightening. When it is dark, the darkness is claustrophobic. When it is day, you are hot and wish to be cool and dream of ice cream and pour seawater on yourself. When it is night, you are cold and wish to be warm and dream of hot curries and wrap yourself in blankets. When it is hot, you are parched and wish to be wet. When it rains, you are nearly drowned and wish to be dry. When there is food, there is too much of it and you must feast. When there is none, there is truly none and you starve. When the sea is flat and motionless, you wish it would stir. When it rises up and the circle that imprisons you is broken by hills of water, you suffer that peculiarity of the high seas, suffocation in open spaces, and you wish the sea would be flat again. The opposites often take place at the same moment, so when the sun is scorching you till you are stricken down, you are also aware that it is drying the strips of fish and meat that are hanging from your lines, and that it is blessing your solar stills. Conversely, when a rain squall is replenishing your fresh water supplies, you also know that the humidity will affect your cured provisions, and that some will probably go bad, turning pasty and green. When rough weather abates, it becomes clear that you have survived in the sky's attack and the sea's treachery. Your jubilation is tempered by the rage that so much fresh water should fall directly into the sea, and by the worry that is the last rain you will ever see, that you will die of thirst before the next one drops. The next drops fall. This is such a powerful paragraph, where it just talks about all these opposites and all these contradictions, and how when you're in one place you wish for something else, but when you're in that place you wish for the opposite. And as much as it's talking about sort of being in the ocean, it's also an incredible life lesson. The worst pair of opposites is boredom and terror. Obviously Pi experienced both of these a lot when he is a castaway in the Pacific. Only death consistently excites your emotions, whether contemplating it when life is safe and stale, or fleeing it when life is threatened and precious. Life on a lifeboat isn't much of a life. It's like an endgame in chess, a game with few pieces. The elements couldn't be more simple, nor the stakes higher. Physically, it is extraordinarily arduous, and morally it is killing. You must make adjustments if you want to survive. Much becomes expendable. You get your happiness where you can. You reach a point where you're at the bottom of hell, yet you have your arms crossed and a smile on your face, and you feel you're the luckiest person on earth. Why? Because at your feet you have a tiny dead fish. This, I think I spoke about this line in one of the earlier videos, and how he talks about how one of the ways to survive is to constantly feel like you are evading death, because it excites your emotions. Otherwise, it's just sort of this monotonous, sort of boring and arduous journey. So having those moments of like escaping death becomes actually important for your survival, which is an interesting, I think a lot of these are, they seem paradoxical in nature, but really interesting reflections about life that he gets from his journey that we can also think about in our own lives. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. Today's video we're looking at part 2.4 of Pi's time as a castaway. So we're looking at the island that he stumbles across and his arrival in Mexico, the end of his journey essentially. So as in the previous videos, we're going to use the quotes to go off, and we're going to use the quotes to get an understanding of the plot line of what happens when he's on the island, how he feels, what his emotions and thoughts are, and then the same of Mexico. I feel like these two parts are a lot more plot based than perhaps, when Pi is, on the Pacific itself and he's trying to survive. There's a lot of analysis we can do about his character, about themes, etc. But the island in Mexico, to me, more represents the plot line that you could be asked in contextual questions. So you need to be aware of what goes on and what the order of events are. I made an exceptional botanical discovery, but there will be many who disbelieve the following episode. Still, I give it to you now because it's part of the story and it happened to me. So this is a very interesting line to sort of start off with this venture with, and it does point to the fact of, in my head, I always struggle to believe that this is a literal thing that actually happened, but perhaps it could be something figurative, something that Pi perhaps hallucinates. Obviously, he presents it as though this is something that actually happened, but I'll maybe speak a little bit at the end on sort of my opinion of it. But in terms of contextual questions, you would have to answer this as though it did really happen, even though it's difficult to believe. A dilated sleep that had brought no rest and no dreams. So that just speaks about his suffering, and how we spoke about this in another video about how, when you're in that situation, like a castaway, you're not going to sleep very well. I blinked deliberately, expecting my eyelids to act like lumberjacks, but the trees would not fall. So he sees the trees, he thinks it's some sort of joke or hallucination, but he keeps blinking and they're still there. Who had ever heard of land with no soil, with trees growing out of pure vegetation? I felt satisfaction because such a geology confirmed that I was right, that the island was a chimera, a play of the mind. By the same token, I felt disappointed because an island, any island, however strange, would have been very good to come upon. To take in green after so much blue was like music to my eyes. Green is a lovely color. It is the color of Islam. It is my favorite color. The current gently pushed the lifeboat closer to the illusion. Chlorophyll heaven. I expected the bubble of illusion to burst at any second. It was my nose that was the judge of land. My legs began to shake. So he's noticing some sort of difference, and just the fact, by virtue that it's different, just being on the open water is something of note and is something important to him, and gives him sort of this new lease on life. The algae had a light sweetness that outdid in delight even the sap of our maple trees here in Canada. But it was a tree, and a tree is a blessedly good thing to behold when you've been lost at sea for a long, long time. Oh, that I could be like it, rooted to the ground, but with every hand raised up to God in praise, I wept. So he's sort of mimicking the trees and thinks of how he wishes that he could be like the tree. A tree is rooted on land because he misses land so much, and he's sort of, just like trees have their branches pointing up to the heavens, he wishes he could put his arms to the heavens to praise and thank God. Reluctantly, strictly for safety's sake, I crawled back into the lifeboat. So he's not believing that this place is actually safe, that he can be there. It was very painful, but afterwards I fell into the deepest, most refreshing sleep I had had since the night before the Sitzman sank. When I woke up in the morning, I felt much stronger. I have read that there are two fears that cannot be trained out of us: the startled reaction upon hearing an unexpected noise, and vertigo. I would like to add a third, to wit, the direct approach of a known killer. I feared the defensive wall of my whistleblowers was about to crumble and that he would attack me. I calmed down. I reminded myself forcefully that this had been my situation for the last long while, to be living with a live tiger hot beneath me. At every fall, I had a full meal of algae. So as he's exploring, he just keeps on eating this algae that's growing. He is totally sort of in heaven, in the sense of it's something completely different from his life on the lifeboat, and he's finally able to eat and feel full and have his feet on land. I would conservatively estimate to be hundreds of thousands of meerkats. The landscape was covered in meerkats. And then he notices that it's not just these trees and this algae that's growing with no soil, that there's all of these meerkats around. And then he notices something even stranger. The meerkats were bringing ashore dead fish they had not killed. But what were seafaring fish doing in a freshwater pond? How had they got there? The algae naturally and continuously desalinated seawater. The effect of bathing in pure, clean, salt-free water was more than I could put into words. Once again, that idea of perspective, right? Something maybe we take for granted in our everyday life, of bathing not in seawater. Something that is really important and groundbreaking to Pi at this point in his journey. He killed beyond his need. He killed meerkats that he did not eat. In animals, the urge to kill is separate from the urge to eat. To go for so long without prey and suddenly to have so many, his pent-up hunting instinct was lashing out with a vengeance. So this is a significant point, because throughout this journey, Pi and Richard Parker, and we spoke about this in a previous video about how they sort of come together and they unite and they sort of become one aspect or aspects of each other in this shared journey and shared experience. But as soon as there's a change, as soon as now they're not stuck on this lifeboat together, they're exploring this island, immediately they both turn to their individual ways. So Pi goes towards the human side, right? He's going to eat, he's going to bathe, he's going to engage with that aspect of himself, and Richard Parker delves into sort of animalistic urges to kill for the sake of killing. So just notice how when they're in the same boat, literally and figuratively, then they sort of start becoming alike. But as soon as there's there's some sort of normality in terms of land, then there's a shift, and we're going to see that in Mexico as well when Richard Parker leaves Pi very unceremoniously. The next morning after he had gone, I cleaned the lifeboat. So it was just like a new start, a new perspective, and this is sort of links to what I think this island venture is really about. It's about sort of this new slate or this reset that Pi has that allows him to keep going and allows him to persevere and survive until Mexico. Put simply, I returned to life. I lived through a major storm while on the island, and after the experience I would have trusted staying on it during the worst hurricane. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle to sit in a tree and see giant waves charging the island. In this respect, the island was Gandhian. It resisted by not resisting. Every wave vanished into the island with a clash, with only a little frothing and foaming. So there's a little bit of like mystique here. It's very mysterious and almost magical. How can this island be like this? Harder to understand was the island's complete desolation. I never saw such a stripped-down ecology. The air of the place carried no flies, no butterflies, no bees, no insects of any kind. The trees sheltered no birds. The plains hid no rodents, no grubs, no worms, no snakes, no scorpions. They gave rise to no other trees, no shrubs, no grasses, no flowers. The ponds harbored no freshwater fish. The seashore teemed with no weeds, no crabs, no crayfish, no coral, no pebbles, no rocks. With the single notable exception of the meerkats, there was not the least foreign matter on the island, organic or inorganic. It was nothing but shining green algae and shining green trees. So if you get a contextual question about what makes this island different or weird or strange, you have lots of answers from this quote. Which meant that these trees either lived in a symbiotic relationship with the algae in a giving and taking that was to their mutual advantage, or simpler still, were an integral part of the algae. Was rather a free-flowing organism, a ball of algae of leviathan proportions. It would all bear much further study, but unfortunately I lost the algae that I took away. Just as I returned to life, so did Richard Parker. So he even claims that he took some of the algae and kept it in the lifeboat to study when he arrived on land, but unfortunately it got lost. And he says that he and Richard Parker both had this reset. They both returned to life. His weight went up, his fur began to glisten again, and he returned to his healthy look of old. He kept up his habit of returning to the lifeboat at the end of every day. I always made sure I was there before him, copiously marking my territory with urine so that he didn't forget who I was and what was whose. So remember that this is not just a complete break. He still has the lifeboat, and obviously the lifeboat, he's still going to get back on it. Obviously not in the way that he expects at this point, but he makes sure to keep up sort of Richard Parker's training, to keep that distance between them. So he really has this rational, reasonable headspace. That night, as he was resting 2 feet beneath me, I came to the conclusion that I had to step into the circus ring again. The major difficulty in training animals is that they operate either by instinct or by rote. But he remained tense. I knew him well enough to sense it. Eventually, I quit the boat. To survive for so long in a lifeboat with a 450-pound Bengal tiger only to die up in the tree in the hands of 2-pound meerkats struck me as a tragedy too unfair and too ridiculous to bear. Not a square inch of space was left free. So he decides that he's going to now sleep on the island, sleep in the tree. Why not? And he does this and leaves Richard Parker to the lifeboat. But when he's up there one night, all these meerkats come crowding around him. And he has this little statement where he's like, this would be a real tragedy if I died from all these meerkats in a tree when I've been surviving for days and days on end with a 450-pound tiger on a tiny lifeboat. So I began to sleep in the tree every night. I emptied the lifeboat of its useful items and made myself a nice treetop bedroom. The answer to the mystery came somewhere later, from deep within the forest. I noticed the tree because it seemed to have fruit. Each was at its center a number of twigs that were tightly curled around it to protect, I suppose. So now this is when he's going to find out the truth of the island. And he wishes that he hadn't figured out the truth of the island, but he does. Ah, how I wish that moment had never been, but for it I might have lived for years. Why, for the rest of my life on that island. Nothing, I thought, could ever push me to return to the lifeboat and to the suffering and deprivation I had endured on it. Nothing. What reason could I have to leave the island? Were my physical needs not met here? Were there not more fresh water than I could drink in all my lifetime, more algae than I could eat, and when I yearned for variety, more meerkats and fish than I could ever desire? If the island floated and moved, might it not move in the right direction? Might it not turn out to be a vegetable ship that brought me to land? In the meantime, did I not have these delightful meerkats to keep me company? And wasn't Richard Parker still in need of improving his 4th jump? The thought of leaving the island had not crossed my mind once since I had arrived. It had been weeks, many weeks now. I couldn't say how many exactly, and they would stretch on. I was certain about that. How wrong I was. And then it came to light, an unspeakable pearl at the heart of the green oyster. A human tooth. 32 teeth, a complete human set, not one tooth missing. Understanding dawned upon me. I did not scream. I think only in movies is horror vocal. I simply shuddered and left the tree. I think that's such a wonderful way that he's put that. And it's once again, it makes it really realistic, and his reaction that he doesn't scream. He's just completely, he has this understanding, and he runs to the lifeboat. He knows he has to get away from this island. And so he sees that this island is this carnivorous island that is sort of absorbing people or absorbing living things. Still my feet burned. They burned all night. I couldn't sleep for it and from the anxiety. The island was carnivorous. This was why Richard Parker returned to the boat every night. This was why the meerkat slept in the trees. This was why I'd never seen anything but algae on the island. How long does it take for a broken spirit to kill a body that has food, water, and shelter? I preferred to set off and perish in search of my own kind than to live a lonely half-life of physical comfort and spiritual death on this murderous island. I filled my stores with fresh water and drank like a camel. I ate algae throughout the day until my stomach could take no more. I killed and skinned as many meerkats as would fit in the locker and on the floor of the lifeboat. I reaped dead fish from the ponds. With the hatchet, I hacked off a large mass of algae and worked a rope through it, which I tied to the boat. I could not abandon Richard Parker. To leave him would mean to kill him. He would not survive the first night. Alone in my lifeboat at sunset, I would know that he was burning alive, or that he had thrown himself in the sea where he would drown. I waited for his return. I knew he would not be late. So he makes preparations to leave the island, and as you can see, it's almost like this literal, well, to him it's literal, to me I would think it's more figurative, but either way, it's this reset that he has, and he refuses to leave Richard Parker behind. This really emphasizes their connection as well. But yeah, so you definitely have to be writing in your contextual questions about the island being literal, as Pi sees it, that this was something that actually happened. But yeah, in my mind, this is more of a reset or some sort of hallucination that gives him the energy and the power to continue to go. That's my opinion. Okay, then when he arrives in Mexico, remember he is taken to the hospital, and this, the quotes that I brought here, this is when he is telling his story to the Japanese investigators who come to investigate the sinking of the ship. They're trying to find out answers about it, and they're completely taken aback with Pi's story. They don't really believe him, and then he changes the story, and this is where it really, if you thought the novel was complicated up to this point, then now it gets even more complex and more detailed and more makes you think about different things, and the more we're going to have all different interpretations. Anyone who reads this, I think, has a different interpretation. He and Mr. Chuba spoke with Mr. Paisi and Mulata Patel in English for close to 3 hours, taping the conversation. February 19th, 1978. I'd like another cookie. Yes, of course, Mr. Chiba. He's already had plenty, and most he hasn't even eaten. They're right there beneath his bedsheet. So Pi immediately asks for more food, and he doesn't actually eat it, he just hides it, and this shows the impact of the Pacific on him. Obviously he's still recovering. It's just been a couple of weeks since he found land, and so he's like hoarding food at this point. Mr. Patel, we don't believe your story. These things don't exist. To which Pi responds, only because you've never seen them. Not plants that contradict the laws of nature. What you don't realize is that we are all strange and forbidding species to wild animals. We fill them with fear. They avoid us as much as possible. It took centuries to still the fear in some pliable animals. Domestication, it's called. But most cannot get over their fear, and I doubt they ever will. When wild animals fight us, it is out of sheer desperation. They fight when they feel like they have no other way. It's a very last resort. In a lifeboat, come on, Mr. Patel, it's just too hard to believe. If you stumble at mere believity, what are you living for? Isn't love hard to believe? Mr. Patel, don't you bully me with your politeness. Love is hard to believe, ask any lover. Life is hard to believe, ask any scientist. God is hard to believe, ask any believer. What is your problem with hard to believe? We're just being reasonable. So am I. I applied my reason at every moment. Reason is excellent for getting food, clothing, and shelter. Reason is the very best toolkit. Nothing beats reason for keeping tigers away, but being excessively reasonable and you risk throwing out the universe with the bathwater. So they have a lot of back and forth, as you can see here, lots of inverted commas going everywhere, between Pi and these investigators, and they're just coming to ask him very simple questions. They want to know how the ship sank, how he survived, and he is telling his story. But because he's Pi, and because we know all the history about him and his beliefs and how he survived and how he combined reason and faith and everything, he's providing them a story, but they don't believe the story, specifically the part about the island, because they don't think it's reasonable. And Pi is questioning that, and he's actually making a really good point here if you read it carefully. And so he challenges them, and he challenges the reader to think about belief and reason in different ways. So this idea that we spoke about in the previous video about themes, reason is excellent for getting food, clothing, and shelter. Reason is the best toolkit, and this really shows us how he does employ reason, but he also employs faith, as he says, and hope, because he says if you're just reasonable, excessively so, you risk throwing out the universe with the bathwater. We are not seeking to lay criminal charges. You are an innocent victim of a tragedy at sea. We are only trying to determine how the Tsitzman sank. We thought you might help us, Mr. Patel. Tigers exist, lifeboats exist, oceans exist. Because the three have never come together in your narrow, limited experience, you refuse to believe that they might. Yet the plain fact is that the Tsitzman brought them together and then sank. So he's saying the investigators are like, this is crazy. How can you have this scenario of you on a lifeboat with a tiger? And Pi just puts it to them in very plain terms and says, well, you've seen all these separate things, you know that they exist. Now, why is it so difficult to believe that they come together? They also find trouble with the blind Frenchman story. Two blind people in two separate lifeboats meeting up in the Pacific. The coincidence seems a little far-fetched, no? It certainly does. We find it very unlikely. So is winning the lottery, yet someone always wins. We find it extremely hard to believe. So did I. And then Pi says, okay, oh, sorry, not there yet. The cook on the Tsitzman was a Frenchman. They could be bones from another small animal. They were meerkats. So they keep questioning every single aspect of Pi's story. And they say, oh, did the Frenchman, do you mean because, you know, the cook on the ship, he was a Frenchman? And he says, well, no. And they said, oh, the bones that, because Pi says he has bones from the meerkats on the boat to prove the existence of this island. And they were like, well, it could be from another small animal. And Pi keeps saying, no, believe my version of the story. And then he brings up something I never forgot, not for a minute. I lost my whole family. And then when the investigators still don't believe him, he says, okay, so you want another story? And they say, no, we would like to know what really happened. Doesn't the telling of something always become a story? Isn't it just looking upon this world already something of an invention? I know what you want. You want a story that won't surprise you, that will confirm what you already know, that won't make you see higher or further or differently. You want a flat story, an immobile story. You want dry, useless factuality. Isn't that such a wonderful use of words in the way that this writer has written? It's just such beautiful writing. And he basically says here, he understands what they want. They don't want any sort of what actually happened. What they actually want is a sort of flat, believable story that fits into what they've already decided happened with this story. So it's a really interesting to think about as the reader, and this is a really philosophical book that really makes the reader think about all these big questions in life. So I'm right. You want a story without animals. We want a story without animals that will explain the sinking. And then Pi says, here's another story. So now he's going to provide an alternative version of events. And for us as the readers, we need to analyze this and we need to see which version do we believe. And I'll leave that up to you to decide which version you would believe. But Pi presents this whole other story now without the animals, in order to make these investigators believe him, this flat story which would fit into their version of events that they've sort of made up in their head. 4 of us survived. Mother held onto some bananas and made it to the lifeboat. The cook was already abroad, as was the sailor. So you can see how he's equated each of the animals to a human being. I couldn't believe a human being could survive so much pain, so much butchery. It was unbearable to have that beautiful face, so noble and serene, connected to such a sight below. I held my mother's head in my hands. And this part of the story goes really quickly. It goes through, because we've obviously heard the whole story with the animals, and now it compares the mother to the orangutan, the cook to the hyena, and the sailor to the zebra. And very quickly the sailor dies a terrible death, and then the mother is brutally murdered by the cook. He knew it had gone too far, even by his bestial standards. Solitude began. I turned to God and survived. And turned to God, I survived. So that's when he then gets revenge on the cook and he kills the cook. Something that I find really strange about this story, and why I am personally inclined to believe the story with the animals, is that the cook becomes extremely violent very quickly. Like, just as they're on the boat, he immediately starts worrying about food and becoming sort of having these thoughts about cannibalism and things like that. It's almost too quick, in my opinion. So to me, the animal story makes more sense, but obviously you are welcome to have your own opinion. And then now he's by himself in the ocean. Solitude began. Is that better? Are there any parts you find hard to believe? Anything you'd like me to change? So now he asks them, and it's quite humorous to think about how these sort of serious investigators are trying to get a story, and Pi's telling them a story like, this doesn't make sense, it's hard to believe. And he's like, okay, let me change the story for you. And then at the end he's like, anything else you'd like me to change? And if it had, in my experience, when a dingy third-rate rust bucket sinks, unless it has the luck of carrying oil, lots of oil, enough to kill the entire ecosystem, no one cares and no one hears about it. You're on your own. You have doubts about the fitness of the crew, so the ship sank stern first. Did it appear to you that the ship was properly loaded? And this is Pi's response, because the investigators want a reason for why the ship sank, and he has no idea. He says, it was my first time on a ship. I don't know what a properly loaded ship should look like. High, 25, 30 feet. He's trying to describe the waves. And they say, that's quite modest, actually. And he replies, not when you're in a lifeboat. And they say, yes, of course, but for a cargo ship. So he really, it just shows us once again that Pi is a 16-year-old boy, or now he's probably like 17 when he arrives in Mexico, and he is, he doesn't know the specifics, and so the investigators are trying to get a story out of him that they're never going to get because he doesn't know all the specifics. But it's also what he says here about the waves, and they're like, oh, that's not too high, and he's like, well, it depends what perspective you're coming from. That tells you whether that's actually high and dangerous or not. In both stories, the ship sinks, my entire family dies, and I suffer. That's true, right? So this is Pi being very realistic and very sort of blatant and brazen. He says, well, in both of the stories, I'm struggling and I lose and I suffer. So tell me, since it makes no factual difference to you and you can't prove the question either way, which story do you prefer? Which is the better story? The story with animals or the story without animals? I think that this is such an interesting question, like which story do you prefer? Because I'll say which one do you believe is true? He says, okay, neither of them are answering your question. Which do you prefer? And I think it makes us think about novels in general. And it's one of those awesome moments I find when you read a novel and it makes you think about the writing itself. Very thin, very tough, very bright. Soul Survivor could shed no light on reasons for sinking of Sitzman. As an aside, story of Soul Survivor, Mr. Paisi Mulatur Patel, Indian citizen, is an astounding story of courage and endurance in the face of extraordinarily difficult and tragic circumstances. In the experience of this investigator, his story is unparalleled in the history of shipwrecks. Very few castaways can claim to have survived for so long at sea as Mr. Patel, and none in the company of an adult Bengal tiger. So the last few lines, these are from the report that was generated by the investigators, and they comment that obviously the ship sinking could not be solved, but that's not that's not what our focus has been on for this entire story. But he says something to note is the incredible nature of Pi, and how whether it's true or not, what he claimed to survive so long at sea with a tiger is absolutely sort of exceptional and miraculous. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found that video helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, this is the last video in the Life of Pi series. We're going to be discussing Pi's life in Toronto in 3 ways. We're going to talk about what the author notices about Pi. We're going to notice what the author remarks about life in general. That's just a really quick point, and then we're going to talk about Pi's reflections of his life now that he is in Canada, years later, talking to the author. So what the author notices about Pi, he notices a couple of things which I've written out here, and then I've shown you the quotes which prove that. Food insecurity, he's a vegetarian, he still practices 3 religions, he's married with a son and a daughter, he has completely rebuilt his life, but Richard Parker still haunts him. He has vivid memories of some events, but struggles to recall aspects such as his mother's appearance, which deeply upsets him. He has only a few blurry photographs sent to him from India after he arrived in Canada as remnants of his family. So here are the quotes that prove that. His cupboards are jam-packed, a reserve of food to last the siege of Leningrad. Memory is an ocean and he bobs on its surface, but he wants to tell me his story. After all these years, Richard Parker still preys on his mind. He is a sweet man. Every time I visit, he prepares a South Indian vegetarian feast. His house is a temple. Upstairs in his office, there is a brass Ganesha sitting cross-legged next to his computer, and a wooden Christ on the cross from Brazil on a wall, and a green prayer rug in the corner. An intellect confounded, yet a trusting sense of presence and, of course, ultimate purpose. A smile every time, but his eyes tell another story. It's very sad not to remember what your mother looks like. This story has a happy ending. Please pardon my typing error. He is a sweet man, not has a sweet man. So as you can see here, we notice how Pi has transformed, or how he's changed since his experience, but also I'm always struck by how little he has changed. He still practices 3 religions. He's gone back to vegetarianism after he goes through the survivalist ordeal where he has to give that up. He's still optimistic about life, and he has these moments of sadness, obviously, where he doesn't remember certain details, or he doesn't have a lot to connect him to his family, but he's created a new family for himself. He's adapted and into Canadian culture, and he seems to be living a good life. And when the author comes to ask him about these questions and asks him to tell his story, he's happy to share the information. And it's very comforting, I suppose, to see after all he's been through that he does have this beautiful life that he's created. And it shows you once again that the power of free will and about Pi's actions cementing his survival, but also his transformation, also his ability to live this life that he has created for himself. And I think that that's something that, we shouldn't take lightly, because I do feel like this is definitely an example of free will triumphing over fate. just a quick comment that the author remarks about life, which I thought was quite interesting. They were there all along, but I hadn't seen them because I wasn't looking for them. So here he's talking about like the fact that Pi has children and a wife. Like, he didn't notice in the house, but once he knew of their existence, he couldn't help but see all these signs linking to them. And I think that's really significant also in terms of Pi's relationship with God and faith. And it's about, you know, how if you don't look for something, then you're never going to find it. And so Pi looks for things, whether it's in faith, whether it's in his reasonable mind, you know, looking for survival, and therefore he finds things. So that teaches us, I think, a really important lesson about life itself. These are Pi's reflections about his survival and his journey. He asks the author, "Could you tell my jumbled story in exactly 100 chapters? Not one more, not one less." I'll tell you, that's one thing I hate about my nickname, the way that number runs on forever. It's important in life to conclude things properly. Only then can you let go. Otherwise, you are left with words you should have said but never did, and your heart is heavy with remorse. That bungled goodbye hurts me to this day. I wish so much that I'd had one last look at him in the lifeboat, that I'd provoked him a little, so that I was on his mind. I wish I had said to him then, yes, I know, to a tiger, but still, I wish I had said, Richard Parker, it's over. We have survived. Can you believe it? I owe you more gratitude than I can express. I couldn't have done it without you. I would like to say it formally. Richard Parker, thank you. Thank you for saving my life. And now, go where you must. You have known the confined freedom of a zoo for most of your life. Now you will know the free confinement of a jungle. I wish you all the best with it. Watch out, man. He is not your friend, but I hope you remember me as a friend. I will never forget you. That is certain. You will always be with me, in my heart. What is that hiss? Ah, our boat has touched sand. So farewell, Richard Parker. Farewell. God be with you. I think this is really interesting because it tells us of Pi's maybe sort of level of a bit of OCD or his trauma from the past, and the fact that he wants the story to be told in 100 chapters, and he's very, very much he gets upset by his name because Pi obviously is a number that goes on forever and ever. And this shows us, well, this is indicative of the trauma that he went through, where he didn't know when it was going to end. He didn't know when he was going to be rescued, when he was going to find salvation, if he was going to survive. And so now in his life, the effect of that is he tries to find certainty. And this thing of not saying goodbye, we can also see that runs deeply. Obviously, he wasn't able to say goodbye to his family, but he wasn't able to say goodbye to Richard Parker. Richard Parker just left him, and that feeling of abandonment stays with him years and years later. I was overwhelmed by the generosity of those who rescued me. Poor people gave me clothes and food. Doctors and nurses cared for me as if I were a premature baby. There was only one long, easy corridor I had to walk down. To all these people, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks. Pi is extremely optimistic and such an admirable figure. I mean, he could have come off this experience and been totally depressed and traumatized, and he would have had every excuse to be like that. But what he's done, and what we can see from the last bits of the book, or when actually it's not really the last bits, but it's more when the writer switches to italics and we see the author's perspective, is that Pi is extremely grateful for surviving, but also he's extremely optimistic. So he sees his life, he sees what he's done, his ordeal, but he notices its suffering in its finite form, and he's able to rise above that and create this entirely new life for himself. He is so thankful for the generosity he's endured, and he even says, which I think is a bit of a crazy thing to say, he says that he's had one long passage where he's just had to easily walk through to get where he is in life, you know, to have studied at university, to be living this married life in Canada. And I mean, he says from the point where he got off the ship in Mexico, people have been so good to him, and he's grateful for that, and it's all been like, you know, easy from there. So I don't know if that's you know, maybe a bit of an overstatement of things being super easy, but it just shows us Pi's gratitude and his optimism. And I think these things are so important and so integral in his survival process. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel. Thank you.